And this Kahoot, this is going to be a good, like, quick Unit 7 agency Kahoot. These are all going to be true, false. So we're going to get some questions, Unit 7. Make sure we have a good handle on agency as we get into the weekend. So you got a QR code. You can scan that and get in, or go to the website or the app. It's quicker to do the QR code. Some of these avatars crack me up. Anybody in that wants to play? Again, if you don't want to play on your phone, it's okay. Just play in your mind. Kahoot's very, by the way, very basic. One reason I'm limited, I have a character limit. You're not going to see Kahoot type questions on your exam, but I do think it's a good way to make sure we have an understanding of the basics, right? It always starts with the 101. Do you know what the word means? Do you understand the basic concept? So it's kind of a building block. Anybody in that wants to play? We good? All right, let's Kahoot. It's Unit 7, all true and false. Quick agency review. Question number 1, true or false? An agent must provide obedience to third parties. 8 seconds. Agent must provide obedience to third parties. That is not true. Let's rattle it off together. We got clients and customers, and we owe 2 different sets of duties and responsibilities to each. So let's rattle off together. What do we owe our customer? What do we owe that third party? We owe them honesty, fairness, and the disclosure of material facts. That was horrible, y'all. Let's rattle them off together. What do we owe the customer? Honesty, fairness, disclosure of material facts. All right, that's a little bit better. It is the client that gets old car, and obedience being that O in old car, not the third party. Questions on this one? Good morning. You might still be able to. No, you'll have to play in your mind. It looks. Questions on this one? All right, let's see who got it out fastest. Nicole was the fastest, followed by Will and Crystal, Rhonda and Shawnee Poo. Question number 2, true or false? An agent's duty includes disclosing all material facts to all parties involved in the transaction. We always have a duty to disclose material facts. We always have a duty to disclose material facts, whether you're talking to a client or a customer. We always have a duty. Let's try this another way. Now that we understand the roles, my role doesn't matter. As a listing agent, I have to disclose material facts to all parties. As a buyer's agent, I have to disclose material facts to all parties. seller subagent, dual agent, designated dual agent. We always have a duty to disclose material facts. Questions on this one? So we got Nicole staying on top. Crystal came up. Shawnee Poo came up. Rhonda's on the board. Nana's up. Liv is our highest climber, up 6 places. Question number 3, true or false? Failure to disclose material facts is considered a misrepresentation. 5 seconds. Failure to disclose is considered a material fact. What's a misrepresentation? Misrepresentation is a lie. You put false information out there. If you fail to disclose it, you have omitted it. You have kept your mouth shut. So if we're mishandling material facts, if we're mistreating material facts, we're either lying about them or we're keeping our mouth shut. I need questions on this one.
So the answer is true?
Correct.
Yeah, because I put true and mine saying incorrect, but okay.
I'm sorry. No, the answer is false.
So failure to disclose material fact is not a lie? It's not a misrepresentation by the agent?
It's an omission.
You mean, so it's willful, correct?
It's an omission. Failure to disclose means you didn't disclose it. It's an omission. That would have made it true. Lying about the material fact is a misrepresentation would have made it true. Remember with these material facts, let's take this approach with material facts. Let's take this as a twofold approach. When we're talking about looking at the situations, looking at material facts, the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, did they lie about it? Did the agent lie about it? Or did they keep their mouth shut? Determine first what that action was. You either lie or you didn't disclose. You failed to disclose. Once you determine that, then you can go back and determine if it was done intentionally or unintentionally, willfully or negligently. So this is false because it would be an omission. Are we good? I would focus first on the omission and the misrepresentation. All right, just gonna switch things up. Let's see what we got. Nicole staying on top. Shawnee Poo's coming up. Nana's on fire. She's got the highest streak of 3 in a row. Mads is on the board and Liv is on the board. Question number 4, true or false? The customer's motivation for engaging in a transaction must be disclosed. The customer's motivation. Who gets confidentiality? Is it the customer? Shake your head yes or no. Does the customer get confidentiality? No, because what does the customer get? Honesty, fairness, and the disclosure material facts. It's only the client that gets confidentiality. We tell our client everything about our customer. We tell our customer nothing about our client. Questions do we have on this one? So we got Mads took over on fire this round. Shawnee Pooh's still on. Liv came up. Nicole's here. And Nana. Mads is our highest streak. She's on fire this round. Last one, true or false? Working with real estate agent disclosures is required in all real estate transactions. Is the disclosure required in lease transactions? Shake your head yes or no. Is it required in lease? No. Thus, it's not required in all. We got to remember, talking about a real estate transaction, it could be for sale, it could be for lease. I think what makes this one so hard, a lot of you are coming into this focusing on sales. Why do I care about property management, Julie? Maybe you're coming in as property management. You're going, why do I care about sales, Julie? Why do you need to care? Because we got to get you through the tests. So if you're coming in with the mentality of sales, I think that's great. But we got to remember there's for lease as well. And when they say all, they're referring to sales and lease. Disclosures only required with sales transactions. Questions on this one? Let's check out our podium. Third place is Matt, little pancake hat. Second place is Nicole, came back up. And our first place is Shawnee Pooh. Just the name alone. I got runners up of Lil Big and oh, I missed the fifth. Somebody got that. Your phone might tell you. Guys, please, as you continue studying, go back and keep looking at Unit 7. Go back and keep looking at Unit 8. I fear this is what happens sometimes. We're moving right along, and we will continue to do so we can cover all the material. And as you guys are studying, if you don't look at agency until the end of February, it's like learning it new all over again. So do a little bit each time, right? You're not going to be able to sit down and study Unit 7 every single study session you have. But if you don't touch it for a month, you're going to lose it. So I beg you to incorporate 7, 8, 9, and 10 as just part of your study routine so you can stay familiar with it. Do I have any questions or comments? All right, so we're going to pick back up Unit 8. We're still on agency, just focusing more on the contracts and spending more time in particulars about working with sellers and particulars and working with buyers. So right now, where we left, this is the slide we last left on Tuesday. And we talked about getting ready for that listing appointment. Maybe it's a competitive listing appointment. Maybe the seller calls you and says, I want to hire you. When can you come over and sign the paperwork, right? I mean, there's no wrong way to get this done. You may have to woo them first. You may have to win them over before you're ready to go back and actually start listing. So we talked about the importance of the broker learning as much about the home as possible. Start with Google. Start with the register of deeds and the tax records and the, what else? The zoning and the school board and NCDOT. Learning about the property. And then we're going to gather, we talked about gathering some documents. We want to see the deed. We want to know who can sell this home. We want to know on day one who I need to show up at closing to sign. And if somebody needs to sign to convey the deed and they're unwilling to sign the listing agreement, you should have a little red flag go up. We need to make sure that we get everybody on board that needs to sign that deed to convey on day one. Other documents we talked about, if it's in an HOA, we can get covenants, bylaws, articles of incorporations, etc. So let me ask you guys a question. Set your chat to private. There's something we need to do very early with this relationship with the seller. It might be on the phone when we're scheduling the appointment. It might be when we get to the home when we're actually there for the listing appointment. Tell me in the chat, what is that thing that we need to do very early? Maybe it's on the phone, maybe it's in person when we get there, but it's got to be handled in the beginning, near the beginning. One of the first things we need to do with this seller. Close enough. I got you. I know what you mean. Yeah. So one of the first things that we need to do with the seller is go over that working with real estate agent disclosure. Remember that by first substantial contact. Is first substantial contact going to happen on the phone when you're scheduling the appointment? Possibly. Don't I need to be on alert for it? Is first substantial contact going to happen when I get there? Probably, because at some point the seller might share something with me. Guys, here's the deal. Well, first off, we mentioned the other day that competitive listing appointments are very much a real thing right now, which means sellers may be talking to 2 or 3 agents and then deciding who they want to hire. You may or may not know that you're in a competitive listing appointment. But one of the things that we need to make sure that we explain to the seller early on at this listing appointment is that they need to be careful about what they say to me. Because if they don't hire me, then I don't owe them confidentiality. So before I start asking a lot of questions or they start volunteering a lot of information, we need to do this disclosure and make sure they understand that. Imagine a scenario. You go on, maybe you don't know you're on a competitive listing appointment. I saw Katrina, I'm going to pick on you today, okay? So I looked up, Katrina and I are at a competitive listing appointment. Maybe we know about it, maybe we don't. Katrina goes that morning, I go that afternoon. Only one of us is going to get the job, right? So let's say in our listing appointment, the seller shares something with me before or after I warned them, before or after I Mirandaized them. And then the seller decides to hire Katrina. Katrina got the listing. I later bring the buyer to that transaction. Who do I owe my loyalty to? Who do I have to share that with? It's the buyer. And the seller has that right to know. The seller has that right to know that if for whatever reason you choose not to hire me, you need to understand that I don't know that confidentiality. Guys, I'm here to tell you right now, sellers are really proud. I mean, let's think about this. This is their home, right? Blood, sweat, and tears went into this. You remember when little Johnny fell over there and scraped his knee? Oh, you know, there's memories, there's stories. To the seller, this is a home. To everybody else in this world, this is just a house. So the sellers have pride. And when you go to that listing appointment, they're so excited. They want to give you the grand tour. They want to show you what they have. But before we need to control that conversation And before we get the grand tour or get too far, you guys with me? Because we know it's going to lead to first substantial contact. Remember what the commission rule says. We have to do the disclosure before first substantial contact. So if you know it's coming, like at a listing appointment, get it out early. So now we can go, now that the seller has an understanding of what I can or should not do. Now we can go through and tour the whole, now we can ask questions, they can share information. Obviously, they still may not hire me, but we got to give them that warning. Please remember, a couple of you in the chat, I think it just might be a wording confusion, but I just want to clarify it. The working with real estate agent disclosure is just that. It is a disclosure. It's not an agreement. It's not a contract. We're not forming any kind of relationship. I'm just disclosing my agency status. I'm disclosing the fact that I don't owe you confidentiality. So please keep those separate. A disclosure is not an agreement. Questions? So Katrina's got the listing. Katrina got the call later today and said, we're going to hire you. Now Katrina's got some work to do. And Katrina's got to get this property ready to put it in the system, to put it in MLS. So now, you know, she's going to probably schedule time to go back with the seller where they can work on their paperwork, get the things together that they need. You may have to make several trips to that home to get it ready. At some point, we got to gather the information. We got to either take pictures or arrange for your photographer to go out there. We got to go out and measure or arrange for your guy to go out and measure. We're going to talk about measuring in just a bit. Once you know you have the listing, we're going to do our paperwork. And in part of our paperwork is our agency agreement, but it's also going to include getting the information about the property. So we're going to get our listing data sheet. We're going to gather information so we can advertise and market the property. We will look in just a minute. I have a sample data sheet in the online learning system for you guys. So we'll look at that. You're not going to be tested on it, but I think it helps for you guys to see, for you guys to understand what all is going to be involved. And you're going to see familiar terms on this data sheet, like, you know, zoning. So it kind of helps. Why do we talk about all that stuff at first? So we'll look at that in just a minute. As we're going through and inspecting the property with the seller, getting the information that we need for the data sheet, we need to be on the lookout for red flags. And we need to be prepared to ask the seller questions. We need to ask things like, have you had recent renovations or repairs? Remember that mechanics lien? We want to make sure if they're really recent that that's been handled. Maybe we have a red flag, maybe it just comes up in conversation. We need to ask questions. And I think most importantly, we need to listen. I think that's a trait all by itself. So we're asking questions. We're looking for these red flags. We need to find out if it's on public sewer or is it on site. If it's an on-site septic system, we need to ask if they have a permit. If they don't have a septic permit, encourage the seller to contact the county health department and get one. I can't advertise the number of bedrooms if I don't have my hands on that permit. If it's public, it doesn't matter. But if it's an on-site septic system, we need to get that permit so we know how many bedrooms to properly advertise. Anybody remember how many human heartbeats per bedroom the septic system allows? Human heartbeats? 2. And I say human because our 4-legged family members don't qualify in that. So 2 human heartbeats. Sometimes sellers will look at you and say, well, I don't know if it's public or on site. How would I know that? Ask to see their most recent water bill. If they have a charge for sewer, they're on public. If they don't, they got a septic tank somewhere in their yard. It's got to go somewhere. So either they're paying for it to go public or it's on site. It might be community. So if it's part of their HOA dues, for example. This is all stuff we do before we list a property. Absolutely. I am gathering mode. I'm gathering. I got to get all the information, so I list it all at once. We need to discuss the marketing plan with the seller. You know, guys, don't look at the seller and say, if you let me list your house, I'm going to put your listing in MLS. You know what every single agent in the entire state's going to do when they get your listing? Put it in MLS. Whoop-de-doo. How are you going to stand apart? What are you going to do different? How are you going to market other than MLS? Are you going to do social media? Do you have online, or you have some print medias that you're going to use? What is your marketing plan? Your firm will help you. I love it when I see agents out there on social media thinking outside the box, putting themselves outside of their comfort zone. And then we need to somehow determine the square footage. Again, we're going to talk about what qualifies as living square footage in just a bit. But bottom line, it comes down to either you need to measure it or you need to hire somebody to measure it. We're responsible for the square footage. Again, more on that in just a minute. So I want you guys, we're going to skip ahead just in the book. Let's skip ahead to page 204. What we're skipping is the listing agreement, specifically the out-of-date listing agreement. So remember to always go to the online learning system to look at the listing agreement. The listing firm more than likely will be willing to compensate a buyer's agent. So that's where we are on 204, how the buyer's agent can get a fee. Again, we're going to look at that in our listing agreement, that breakdown. The success fee, the name pretty much says itself. You get paid when you successfully have done the job. When you bring that buyer, when you connect that buyer and that seller, when we get to closing, that's our success fee. Again, there's a difference in when we earn our commission versus when we actually get paid. The buyer's agency agreement, we will see, may also allow for us to collect a retainer fee. A retainer fee is just collecting money up front, commission up front from the buyer. If your firm allows it, you may be able to collect a retainer fee. If we go to closing, then we'll deduct that from the commission that we owe. If we don't go to closing, then the agent's been paid for some of their time, mileage, out showing properties, that kind of thing. Again, whether or not you can collect a retainer fee is going to be up to your firm and your firm's policy. I do know this: you cannot attempt to collect a retainer fee in an oral buyer agency agreement. If you're going to collect a retainer fee from the buyer, we got to get that thing in writing. There's a law and a rule that addresses your commission. 93A-6 is the law. This is another one that I have in the online learning system under the Campbell folder. I think you guys should read this. It's there for you guys. 93A-6 is disciplinary action by the commission, and it does address compensation. There's also a commission rule. This one's just here for reference. The 58A.0102 is just here for reference. But bottom line, what both of these are saying when it comes to our commission, provisional brokers and full brokers can only be compensated from their firm that they're affiliated with. In other words, we cannot be compensated directly from the principal. The principal pays the firm pays us. And that's what this law and rule are covering. Somebody asked about fixtures. Absolutely. As we're going through the home, we're going to ask about fixtures. And as a matter of fact, our listing agreement gives us a list of fixtures. So we can actually stand there and look at the list and say, what are you going to? So we'll look at that in just a bit. We're going to look at our listing agreement soon. In your book, skip ahead one more time to page 211. Again, what we are skipping is the out-of-date buyer's agency agreement. We'll see that in the online learning system. And on 211, we talk about how we split this commission. if it's a co-brokered sale, a co-brokered sale is two different firms. The seller's represented by a firm and the buyer's represented by a different firm. And those two firms are coming together to co-broker the deal. We're coming together to work the deal together for the best interest of our clients. When the listing agent puts the listing in MLS, one thing that they advertise, something that the public doesn't see, you can only view it as a member of MLS. When you look at this listing, you know how much commission the listing firm is offering. So remember, in a typical transaction, a co-broker transaction, the seller pays the listing firm shares their commission with whomever's bringing the buyer. So as the buyer's agent, when your buyer calls you and says, I want to see 123 Main Street, you log into MLS, you look it up, and you see how much commission they're offering you. So we're going to advertise that commission in MLS. The co-brokered sale, the multiple listing services creates that agreement between the seller and the listing firm. The listing firm discusses with the seller how much of that commission we're going to share with whomever brings the buyer. Remember, we said the other day when we were talking about price fixing that firms set commission. Firms determine the commission. There is no, everybody in the area charges X amount. It's all up to the firm's policy. And you as a buyer's agent may look in the MLS one day and see that the commission being offered by the listing firm is not what your firm expects to collect when working with a buyer. For example, I had buyers once, they were interested in a property. I logged into MLS and I saw that they were offering me 0.5% commission, 0.5%. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you what my firm expects to collect when we work with a buyer, but I will tell you it's a heck of a lot more than 0.5%. It's not going to get us far, is it? I'm a little naive. I know this about myself. So I saw this 0.5%. I immediately called the listing agent, said, I think I found a mistake in your listing. She said, no, that's all my seller's willing to pay you. I said, wow, all right. If the seller's not willing to pay me what my firm expects to collect, who's the other party in this transaction, in this sales? The buyer. So if the seller can't or won't pay me, the buyer has to. And that's what our buyer's agency agreement says. Assuming we have that thing in writing, they've agreed to pay me X amount. It doesn't say it always is going to come from you. Actually, what our buyer's agency agreement says is that I will always ask the seller first. I will always go to the seller first. But if they can't or won't, you're on. So in this case, I called the listing agent, felt like a fool, told her have a nice day, called my buyers and said, we're scheduled for this afternoon, but I need you to understand the commission that they're offering me isn't enough. If you move forward with this transaction, you're going to have to ante some up. We had a written agreement. They've already agreed to do it. But now that we're here, it's not a bad idea to revisit it. It's not a bad idea to have that conversation. So co-brokered sales, how much the buyer's firm is going to get is going to be advertised in the MLS. We'll see this agreement between the seller and the listing firm. We'll see the breakdown when we look at our listing agreement. Another way that fees can be split is an in-house sale. In-house sale is how many firms? How many firms? Just one. Just one. We're all working together to help the buyer and the seller. How are you going to get paid? What does your split look like? If we're keeping the transaction in-house, it's going to be up to your firm's policy. How much they expect to collect, how much they're going to share with you. The other way that we could split the fees is if we co-list it. Maybe two or more firms come together to share a listing. Those two firms are going to have to determine how much we charge the seller, how much we are going to share amongst each other, and how much we are going to share with whomever brings the buyer. Some examples of when your firm, two firms may do a co-listing. Do I have anybody in like Burlington area? Mebane, Graham, Whitsett, down there and there? That's kind of a gray area, which means it could fall under Triad MLS. It could also fall under Triangle MLS. So some sellers may want to co-list. They may want to co-broker the deal, have a Triad agent list it and have a Triangle agent list it to increase their exposure. That may be an example of when we co-list it if the firms obviously are in agreement. Another good example, you get the call, no, not if, when you get the call to list that $5 million property, the seller may want to co-list that. They may want extra exposure for that $5 million. So that may be another, I'll take a percentage of 5 million. Yeah, that'll work. So just a couple different ways that fees can get split. Any questions on those? So starting on page 211, we're going to talk about several different types of listing agreements. It'd be way too boring to just have one listing agreement, wouldn't it? So we got several different types. And these types of listing agreements tend to be a problem topic. So please make a note, 211. The first type of listing agreement we have is something called an open listing. An open listing is non-exclusive. If it's non-exclusive, how many firms can the seller date? As many as they want. They're out there playing the field, aren't they? They could hire one, they could hire 5. It's non-exclusive. There are multiple agents, multiple firms. However, the only one that's going to get paid is the selling agent. The only one that's going to get paid is the one that brings the buyer. So the seller hires 5 firms. If one of those 5 firms bring the buyer, then that one will get paid. If none of those 5 firms bring the buyer, the one that did will get paid. Only the selling firm will get paid. And the seller retains the right to sell it themselves. If they can prove that they sold it without the help of any of the 5 firms, they don't have to pay anybody. So the seller's chit-chatting with a coworker on the break room, and they sell their house in the break room. Did the agent sell that house? Were they there? No, it was the seller. They could say, I don't have to pay you any commission. All right, before y'all get too excited and up in arms, here's the good news. These aren't common. These are not common. As a matter of fact, a lot of MLSs don't allow them. You may have more rural parts of the state, but I think for the most part, I know Triad MLS doesn't allow it. These were more common than what they used to be. Think pre-internet. Pre-internet, it was about what this firm is going to do to market and advertise. What's this firm going to do? What's this firm going to do, right? And so by bringing all those 5 firms together, pulling those listings, the seller had more exposure. And I think as the internet took over a lot of our advertising, it's not just local marketing anymore, it's, you know, worldwide. These are doing away. And like I said, most MLSs do not allow them. This is one of these, let me get you through this test or these tests, and you'll probably never see an open listing again. But we got to get you through the tests. So an open listing is a type of a listing agreement. Another type of a listing agreement we have is an exclusive agency listing. Now it's exclusive. Now how many firms is the seller dating? Now how many firms? Just one. Now we got some commitment, right? Seller's dating one firm. That firm will get paid when somebody brings a buyer. However, with these, the seller still retains the right to sell it without you. So if you or another agent bring the buyer, we'll get you paid. If the seller brings the buyer, if they say, ooh, my cousin now wants to buy my house, they retain the right to sell it, not pay you. They've sold it without you. These are a little bit better, right? Now we got exclusivity. I hopefully got you getting paid unless the seller sells it. These are allowed. In my 22 years, I've never seen one of these. They're out there. I've never seen it. Your firm may want you to use it. So what's the one we like? The one we like is called the exclusive right to sell listing. One firm, that firm gets paid no matter where the buyer comes from. Did I bring the buyer? Did another firm bring the buyer? Did the seller bring the buyer? Makes no difference. The exclusive right to sell listing agreement, the firm gets paid no matter where that buyer comes from. Does that sound a little better? Do we like that? This is the only one I've ever seen. Again, I know the question is, well, how do I know which one to use? Firm's policy. The exclusive right to sell listing agreement is what we're going to look at in just a bit. That's the form we're going to look at, because that's the one that's used the most often, the most common. So what I've done, y'all put your pencils down just for a second. I've combined these three, gave you this nice little handy dandy chart. And additionally, I have taken this slide and pulled it out by itself and just loaded this slide in the online learning system. Because I think in a month or so, when you guys are starting to review for your exam, this is a good, quick review. The dollar signs indicate that's when you get paid. So it breaks down the different scenarios, the open listing, the exclusive agency, and the exclusive right to sell. The dollar signs mean the opportunities when you get paid, and does the seller retain the right to sell, yes or no? So again, this very slide is in the online learning system. I'll show it. We're going to go out there in just a bit. Probably when we get back from break. So we'll show you where that is, so you have it to review when you're getting ready for that test. Questions on the different types of listing agreements. So I got a question for you guys. Please set your chats, private chat, just to me, and tell me in a private chat, A, B, C, or D. I love it when y'all answer my question with a question mark. Like, are you asking me, or? I'm the one asking the question. No, I'm just kidding. Everybody in? Everybody get a chance to weigh in? So Devin begins marketing her new listing, which her office has the sole right to market. What does the word sole mean? One. So right out the bat, I know I preach about reading the whole question, but right out the bat, can't we eliminate C? Because how many firms are listing this? Just one. The seller decides to sell the property directly to their cousin without going through Devin and avoid the obligation to pay a commission. The type of listing agreement that Devin has with the seller. This is an example of an exclusive agency agreement because the seller retains the right to sell it themselves and not pay anybody. Had this been an exclusive right to sell, Devin would get paid no matter who the seller, or no matter who bought it. May it be the seller's cousin. The net listing we mentioned the other day, that's the one where you know, the seller wants to collect X amount and then the firm collects everything over that. That was in the commission. I think that was on page like 218 or something. What we want is exclusive agency. They have the sole right to market it, but the seller still retains the right to sell it on their own and not pay Devin. Questions on this one? Right. That's right. Exclusive right to sell. The firm gets paid no matter who brings the buyer. So if it were A, the seller sells it to their cousin, the agent still gets paid. That's the difference in the two. The seller retains the right to sell it without you and not pay you, or they don't. Yep. Yep. Let's try this again. A, B, C, or D. Anybody in? So let's talk about Thomas. Thomas lists a property and begins marketing it. The seller sells the property directly to a coworker after talking to them about it in the break room. Despite Thomas's limited involvement, his firm is still owed a commission. This type of agreement was most likely Thomas is going to get paid no matter who sells it. The fact that Thomas didn't do anything, they have this exclusive right to sell that says, I get paid no matter where the buyer comes from. Questions? Okay. We have something called the North Carolina Protection Agreement. This agreement is protecting us. It's nice that we have some protection out there too, right? Particularly, this is protecting our commission. This protection agreement, I'm not trying to create agency. I'm in no way attempting to create agency. The best example of when we would use the protection agreement is when your buyer that you're representing, your buyer client, is interested in a for sale by owner, or as we like to call them, FSBOs. For sale by owner means they went out on their own. They're unrepresented. They do not have a firm. So you have a buyer client. They're interested in seeing a for sale by owner this afternoon. You have to call the for sale by owner directly to schedule with them. They don't have a firm to talk to. So you call the seller and you say, I got a buyer that's interested. Can we come out and see it this afternoon at 2 o'clock? And the for sale by owner says, sure, that's fine. And then you say, are you willing to cooperate with me? Are you willing to pay me if my buyer buys your house? Is the seller under, is this for sale by owner under any obligation to pay you whatsoever? No, they went out on their own. They don't have to hire anybody. They don't have to pay you. So let's say this for sale by owner says, yes, I am willing to cooperate with you if your buyer closes. Shake your head, yes or no. Are you going to take this perfect stranger at their word? No. We got to get an agreement, right? We got to get something in writing. And that's what this is. The name of the form is actually on page 212 in the in practice. It's called an unrepresented seller disclosure and fee agreement. So if this for sale by owner agrees to pay you if your buyer closes, then we use this form to protect our commission. What if? What if the for sale by owner says, no, I'm not going to pay you. That's why I want a loan. I don't want to pay a commission. Is that their right? Sure. If the seller can't or won't pay you, then your buyer has to. And that's what our buyer's agency agreement says. I will always ask the seller to pay me first. But if they can't or won't, the buyer has to. And we're actually going to break down how much we expect to collect. So back to the scenario, or either case, they agree to pay you or not. In addition to possibly needing the protection agreement, what else do I need to do? What else do I need to discuss with this for sale by owner? What else do I need to discuss with them early on? I'm not trying to hire them. I'm not trying to get them to hire me. Yep. I love watching things flow through the chat. Whether they agree to pay you or not, what do I need to do with this for sale by owner? We need to do our working with real estate agent disclosure. Doesn't the seller have the right to know that I represent the buyer in this transaction? Doesn't the seller have the right to know that I don't owe them confidentiality, that my loyalty, my old car is to the buyer? The seller's not going to hire me. They don't want to. They chose to go to loan, and that's fine. Respect their decision. But they still have a right to understand that my loyalty, my old car is the buyer. So we need to do the working with real estate agent disclosure. Somebody just asked in the chat if we're not going to have the seller sign something. We are. We're going to have them sign the unrepresented seller disclosure and fee agreement. That's them, and that's that in practice on page 212. That's them acknowledging in writing. Guys, don't take anybody on their word. Y'all, please listen to me. Nobody's going to look after your commission like you. So make sure you're protected. Make sure if anybody ever agrees to pay you, you get that in writing. So we have to disclose to both. Yeah, we did our working with real estate agent disclosure when we first met our buyer, right? And now we got to do the disclosure for the seller. Let them know where we stand in this transaction. That's what the whole disclosure is about. I don't owe you confidentiality. And remember, my loyalty is to the one that hired me, not necessarily to the one that pays me. So if the FSBO decides to pay you, that doesn't automatically mean they get old car. You guys see the name of the form? What's the first word there? It's an unrepresented seller. Everybody see that? Unrepresented seller. Questions on this? Okay. So let's go ahead and take our break. We come back, we'll keep going. back. So we're going to take attendance. Back to those disclosures real quick. There was a question of disclosures for both. I'm assuming that means buyer and seller. There's a working with real estate agent disclosure for the seller, and there was a working with real estate agent disclosure for the buyer. So remember, anybody that we come into that first substantial contact, we need to make sure that we're covering that. Guys, that's protecting them. That's not helping you. That's protecting them. So before I need to cover just a few more slides, and then we're going to go off PowerPoint for a bit. We're going to look at some things in the online learning system, but I do want to just cover a few more things and get to that place. Most real estate firms are a full service firm, which means they offer everything. You hire them, you pay them a commission, they'll offer you full service. We are starting to see this idea start to pop up. We're starting to see these limited service listing companies. And I need to make sure we understand a few things first off out the bat. These companies they're not limiting their duties, they're limiting their services. So what do I mean by this? The sellers that hire a limited service listing company still get OCAR. They still get OCAR. These firms owe them that. What they're limiting is the services that they offer. They almost provide a menu to the seller, and they have a la carte pricing. What do you want? Well, I want you to put my listing in MLS. I'm going to charge you X amount. I want you to do an open house for me on Sunday. I'm going to charge you X amount. Put a lockbox on the front door. I'm going to charge you X amount. The seller has to determine what service they want, and based on the services that they select, will determine how much commission they owe that listing side. Please do not start or do not allow conversations to happen out there. Some people are calling these things discount brokers. Doesn't that kind of have a negative implication to it? A discount broker. That seller's still getting OCAR. Remember we talked about group boycotting? I'm not allowed to conspire to drive somebody out. If I'm bad-mouthing somebody and calling them a discount broker, that could be some kind of violation. They are a real estate firm. They offer OCAR. The only thing they don't offer is a full service agreement. I've actually done 2 of these as a buyer's agent. I've done 2 of these transactions, and they were both just so lovely. The one of them I did, I sent my buyer open housing that Sunday because I was doing an open house myself. So I told her to go out and look at a couple properties. And she went open housing and called me that afternoon and said, I found the one, I want to make an offer. I said, golly, that was easy. But she told me that when she was at that open house, she met the seller. The seller was doing their own open house. The listing agent wasn't doing it. I went through that entire transaction, and I have yet to this day have had any sort of communication with the listing agent. Everything I did was directly through the seller. Obviously that communication, I'm sure they were working in the background, but here's the deal, you guys. That particular seller knew what they were doing. That particular seller was an investor, and they sell 10, 12 properties a year. I think for that investor that knows what they're doing, they're pretty much just paying to get it into MLS, to get that exposure, get that advertising. If you are talking to somebody that hasn't sold their home in 12 years, things have changed in 12 years. If they don't sell on a regular basis, it might still be recommended that they call a full service, but they can absolutely go through a limited service listing. By the way, when we got to closing on that one and we saw the closing paperwork, they paid me the full commission that my firm expected to collect. and their fee was like $500. They only charged the seller for what the seller wanted. Does that make sense? They still got old car. They just didn't get all the services. And that's what this limited service listing contract is. We have danced all around it. Here it is. We finally get to meet your MLS on page 214. MLS stands for the multiple listing services. I have heard there are about 40 in the state. I don't know all 40. What I do know is once you affiliate with your firm will be a member of a local MLS, and you too will join that MLS, whatever MLS your firm is a member of. Your firm will handle discussing all that with you. There are a couple benefits to the multiple listing services. The biggest one I can think of is it creates an inventory. Once you are a member of an MLS, all listings I have, I agree, go into the multiple listing services. That takes the exposure for my seller to a whole new world. I now have, I don't know, I think at last count there were, I don't remember how many agents are in the Triad. I'm not going to spit out a number, but there's a lot. There's a lot of now agents out there in the Triad MLS. When I put my listing in, I now welcome all of them to sell it. I have exposed my seller's listing. The other big thing about the MLS is this is where we offer compensation to each other. Again, when you have a buyer that calls you wanting to see a property in the MLS this afternoon, you look that property up in MLS and it tells you right there, when you sell this property, this is how much we're going to pay you. This is your offer of compensation. If your firm expects to collect more than what they're offering, then you work that out with the buyer through your written buyer's agency agreement. So MLS is good, it's where it all starts. We're going to look at a sample MLS sheet in just a second. That's what you're looking at 215 and 216 are some of the required listing data fields, things that various MLSs, and they're all different. That's why I say I'm giving you guys a sample. So where we're heading next, we're going to go to the online learning system, and we're going to look at our exclusive right to sell listing agreement. This is standard form 101. You don't need to know the form numbers. However, in time, you'll probably find that the forms you use the most often, you'll know the numbers. North Carolina Association of Realtors, there's probably 500 forms out there. I'm not making that number up. So if you have an idea of your commonly most used forms like standard form 101, it's just easier to find sometimes. But again, you don't need to know the numbers. It just knows it'll come in time. Look with me on page 216. Page 216 of your book starts the conversation of the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. And 216 through the top of 221 talk about some of the more common, some of the more popular provisions of the listing agreement. Now we're going to go through and look at these together, but when you guys are studying this weekend, the recommendation from the book is that you look at the listing agreement and the book simultaneously. So when you're looking at a provision in the book, you find that provision in the listing agreement so you can see it in the agreement and then hear what the book has to say about it as well. So I'm going to go out of here just for 1 second, or I don't know, for a while actually, but for 1 second before we get to the listing agreement. I just want to point out I'm in the online learning system in the Unit 8 material. And there is that one PowerPoint slide that I pulled out about the different types of listing agreements. So I just want to show you guys where it's at, remind you in a few weeks when you're really starting to study for this test that you have this nice little handy dandy side-by-side comparison. The other thing I want to show you guys is the sample MLS form. Now, again, you're not going to be tested on this, but I think it's helpful for you guys to flip through it because it gives you an idea of what we need to gather to get this listing in the system, approximately, understanding all MLSs are different. If it's yellow, that means it's required, meaning I can't submit the listing. until I have this information. Guys, consider this. Listing agents, big part of their job is done up front before that property is ever advertised. We're gathering data, we're getting listing data, listing information, pictures, measuring, all that good stuff. We do a lot of work up front before you ever see it on Zillow.com. So I just have this here for you guys to, just look at. Don't spend all your study time on this, but just look at it. And you can see some various things in yellow that are required. Obviously, we need the street name and number. Where is it located? Zoning, that's a required field. So we got to look that up. Who's the owner, deed, book, and page. Here's our tax information. Again, your firm will help you with all this, where to find this. Agency type. Remember when we said the seller and the listing firm have to identify who's bringing the buyer? Is it going to be a buyer agent only? Is it going to be a seller sub-agent, or is it going to be both? If the listing firm selects buyer agent only, that means seller sub-agents are not allowed. That means the firm and the seller agreed all buyers need to be represented. So we choose that when we put it in to let the other members of the Triad MLS know what agency type we're willing to work with. Showing information about the home, as much in here, as much as you want to describe the property, bathrooms, how many acres. All we're doing is just going through and listing as much as we can, helping the seller to sell by describing the property. The room dimensions. We're going to talk about measuring in just a bit. We have a place here that we could put all the room dimensions. So when I'm actually there measuring, I can jot that down. I actually, particularly this page, when I'm at a listing appointment, I actually print this off and take it with me. I'm kind of old school. I like paper and a pencil and a clipboard. So I actually take this with me. So a lot of you probably prefer your phone, but I like having this with me because as I'm going through the home, I can identify the features of it. I can say, yeah, it's got a smoke alarm. It's got a washer connection, right? As I'm seeing stuff, I can check it off. So when I get home to list it, I can remember. I don't know about y'all, but my little brain is, it's not getting better as I get older. And sometimes all these homes start running together. So if you have some kind of checklist, some kind of way to help you remember this home when you get home to list it, and I just take this with me so I know what I have, what I'm looking for. Here's our fixtures. Are there any fixtures exceptions? What appliances are going to stay? So again, I'll just, you guys may want to flip through this. I have it here just for you, FYI. Directions. Y'all want to know one of my pet peeves? Don't put CGPS. Not everybody has or uses GPS. If you say CGPS, you've just limited your seller's pool of buyers. Give them directions. Not everybody uses their smartphone, y'all. Help them out. Help the buyers get there. All right, that's my soapbox for the day. So here's your input sheet. Again, just for you guys to check out and get a better idea. I think it helps attach. By the way, the commission, if it goes down and they're trying to validate some of the information that was entered, they're going to ask you for a data entry sheet. They're going to ask you for what you use to put it in. So having this on file may serve as good documentation. So now what we're going to do in the Unit 8 material, I'm here under the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. And I have some highlights. The Real Estate Commission says that if it's in the syllabus, it's a good candidate for your exam. So what I did is I took the exclusive right to sell listing agreement and I looked at it with the syllabus. And I highlighted for you the things that are mentioned in the syllabus. Eventually, you guys are going to have to read this whole thing. I don't think you necessarily need to worry about reading the whole thing right now. Let's break it down into chunks. And my way to try to help you is by offering the highlights. help you know what to focus on, help you know what you expect to see on your exams. When you get to post licensing, you're going to spend a lot more time on this form. Obviously, when you're out in the real world, talking with the seller, you're going to be very familiar with this form. So the highlights are there for a reason, and it's to help keep you guys focused on what you need to know to help you get through these tests. We're going to go through this pretty quickly. I mean, I'm not going to stand here and read this to you guys, but we're going to go through it, discuss it, and then let you guys go and check out the highlights. So we're looking at the exclusive right to sell listing agreement. Some of our forms, especially the more common forms, come with guidelines for completing. So if you're ever not sure about what to put in this field, if you're ever not sure what to put in, fill in here, you have guidelines to help provide you information. Yes, you have your broker in charge, you have peers, co-workers in your firm, but just having these guidelines may be another good source for you to make sure you're properly completing it. So our exclusive right to sell agreement is entered into between, and we're going to put the name of all of the sellers, list all of the sellers of the property and the firm. Our agency agreement is between the seller, exclusive right to sell is between the seller and the firm. Just to point out real quick, probably about 8-10 years ago, the forms committee added blue notes and red warnings to various places in our forms. And they did that for a reason, you guys. They're meant to pop out. They're meant to attract our attention, draw our attention, to give us advice, to give us information. So this blue note is basically just talking about if you're getting ready to list an estate, or if it's a corporation, an LLC, that kind of thing, just giving you a little bit of guidance. Another thing I want to point out, seller represents that the seller is not a party to the listing agreement with another firm. Seller also represents that they have received a copy of the working with real estate agent disclosure. That's past tense, isn't it? This is what we're doing. We are actually creating agency. We're using this form for the seller to hire me. Working with real estate agent disclosures already happened. Everybody with me? And that's why that receipt, that's in past tense. We already did that a long time ago when I first met the seller. Now they decided to hire Katrina, and now she's back 3 days later with the listing agreement. You guys with me? So it's received, and the seller just has another opportunity here to represent that they've already received it and have reviewed it with the firm. So the first thing we have here is our term of agreement. We're going to say when the term begins. We're going to begin on the effective date, which is the date that everybody signs it. And then we have to list when it's going to expire. All agency agreements have a definite expiration date. So this agreement shall terminate on 11:59 p.m. on whatever date we put in. Firm policy may tell you how long they have a listing. You and the seller may want to discuss. The current market may determine how long. We didn't need listing agreements for that long last year. We're going to need them for longer in the upcoming years. So we have to have a definite end date. You will note that this blank is blank, because when we see a blank, that's a point of negotiation between the parties to the form. So the seller and the firm have to agree on how long we're going to have this listing. So we have our definite end date, our definite termination date. Before we look at property, hang on. I want to look at the bottom of the first page real quick and point out a few things. Because I'm a member of the National Association of Realtors, I get to use forms that rock the capital R. Members can use the form, non-members, got to get your own forms. Our forms actually come from the state level. That was a terrible line, which is the North Carolina Association of Realtors. So you have the National Association of Realtors and then the state levels who provides our forms. We have our equal housing opportunity logo indicating to the consumer that we do abide by equal housing opportunity, the name of the form, and then the current form. So what we're looking at is July 2022, which is the current. So just pointing out a few things that you're going to see on our forms, all of our forms. Now we got to talk about the property. We're going to list the street address, city, zip, county. This is a North Carolina form, so we know the property is located in North Carolina. They already filled that in for us. In addition to the property, we're also going to talk about the legal description. What subdivision is it in? What's the tax PIN number? What's the deed book and page? Again, all that research you're doing to get ready for the listing, this is where you put that information that you find on various websites. Most of your firms will assist you. They'll help you. They're not just going to leave you out there floundering alone. So they'll help direct you, help show you where you can get this information to fill in. And then we got to talk to the seller about fixtures. You will see here, I got a list of fixtures. These are the exact same fixtures, the exact same list also shows up in our offer to purchase and contract. So we're going to see this exact same list again when we get to unit 10. The reason we have it here in the listing agreement is because we need to have a conversation with the sellers now. Are you going to take any of these fixtures? Because if you are, we need to talk about it. In a perfect world, if the seller says, my ceiling fan has sentimental value to me, and I'm going to take my ceiling fan, great, that's fine. What are you going to do? What are you going to put in that place? When are you going to take it? You know, in a perfect world, the seller will take it down, replace it before a buyer ever sees it. Do we live in a perfect world? No, unfortunately not. So we can try to get the seller to take it down and replace it, but they don't have to. And they may look at you and say, nope, I'm not taking my ceiling fan down until I move. Okay. It now becomes my responsibility as the listing agent to make sure that every buyer that sees this home knows that when they buy, that ceiling fan will not be there. That's my responsibility. When that offer comes in, I, as the listing agent, need to make sure that that ceiling fan is excluded. This is why we need to have a conversation about fixtures up front before we ever list it. So we all make sure we are all on the same page and there's no surprises. If the seller's going to take anything that the buyer's going to see that they're not going to take down before we list it, then we're going to list these fixtures here, items that do not convey. Again, we see this exact same verbiage in our contract. So as the listing agent, you owe that to your seller to make sure when the offer comes in that the ceiling fan is listed as a fixture exclusion. The other thing you'll note here, there's verbiage, seller shall repair any damage caused by removal of any of the items excluded above. So they can't jerk the ceiling fan out of the ceiling and leave me a big hole, right? They got to do something, at a minimum, repair the hole. Maybe they put up a new fixture, maybe they put up a new ceiling fan, don't know, but they just can't leave a big hole in the ceiling. We have to have a similar conversation about personal property. Is there anything you're willing to leave? Just because a seller is willing to leave it doesn't mean a buyer wants it. What we're asking the seller is, if the buyer wants the refrigerator, for example, are you willing to leave it? If the buyer wants the washer dryer. So make sure that they understand if the buyer doesn't want it, they're still responsible for getting rid of it. Again, we'll see that same verbiage in our contract, sales contract. And then we get down here to listing price. Seller lists the property at a price of X amount on the following terms. And then we're going to identify the methods in which the seller will accept payment. Is it going to be a cash buyer, Do they want conventional loan, FHA, VA? We're going to talk about the different loan types when we get to our financing units, units 14 and 15. And one thing we're going to learn, for example, not all homes qualify for FHA or VA. So it may be that we can't work with those loan types. They got to meet certain criteria. They got to meet certain conditions. So a question comes in, can they check more than one? Absolutely. We can say cash buyer only. Maybe I want cash and conventional. Maybe I'm willing to work with everybody. This is just the seller and the agent having the conversation about what types of buyers. The other thing I want to say about this, we're required to have this form, any form, complete before we ask a consumer to sign it. Particularly, we have got to be in total agreement of the purchase price before anybody signs this agreement. In other words, we can't put to be determined in this field. We and the seller have got to come to terms on the amount, specific amount that we're going to list the home for sale. Again, we're going to talk about how we can help the seller determine that list price, how we can help the seller determine how much they can expect to get. We'll have that conversation coming up. Then we talk about your or the firm's compensation. Seller agrees to pay the firm a total fee of either a percentage or a flat fee. We talk to the seller about when we earn our commission. Typically, we earn our commission when we bring that ready, willing, and able buyer to the table. So the firm's compensation, how much does the firm expect to collect? Our listing agreement has something called a protection period. Flip with me real quick to page 218. One of the fun things about real estate is sometimes we have several different words that mean the same thing. So on 218, we see the protection period could also be known as the extender clause, could also be known as the override clause. Isn't that fun? Three things mean the same thing. The listing agreement specifically calls it a protection period. And what the protection period is, it says if circumstances have not occurred, in other words, if I haven't sold your house within the termination date, within X amount of dates after termination, the firm may still be entitled to collect a commission. Let's say, for example, your listing, you've had this listing for 6 months and it expires today, and you guys decided not to extend it. If a buyer brings an offer tomorrow, doesn't it stand to reason that the buyer learned about that property through your marketing and advertising in the last 6 months, through your efforts in the last 6 months? So what this is doing is protecting us in that case, in that scenario. There are two caveats to this. This isn't just any old buyer bringing an offer. The listing agent has to be aware of the buyer interested. They have to provide names to the sellers. So it's not just if any buyer brings an offer tomorrow, it's if the Joneses bring an offer tomorrow. So we have to be aware that somebody's out there considering it, somebody's out there thinking about it. We present the names to the sellers. The second caveat to this, if the seller lists with another firm tomorrow, they relist with another firm tomorrow, we're out because their current agency agreement is with the new firm, and the current agency agreement will always prevail. But if we know we have buyers interested and the seller doesn't relist, we still could collect a commission. Isn't that nice? We agree on how many days, could come down to firm policy, could come between agreement between you and the seller. So I'm going to go back up for 1 second. So up here, we talked about the firm's compensation. How much does the firm expect to collect? The seller pays the listing firm. The listing firm shares their commission with whomever brings the buyer. So we're going to put the total amount that we expect to collect from the seller. And then when we come down here to the next page, now we're going to discuss how much of that commission we're going to share with whomever brings the buyer. And you can see here, we have a couple different choices. Are we willing to cooperate with sub-agents? Are we willing to cooperate with buyer's agents? And if so, how much are we going to share with them? When we talked about the sub-agency, we have to have, the firm has to allow seller sub-agency. The seller has to be in agreement to the seller sub-agency. And this is where we have the discussion with the seller about how much of my commission I'm going to share with the whomever brings the buyer, and who I'm willing to work with, who we're willing to cooperate with. Then we have the firm's duties. Let's understand that our agency agreement is a bilateral contract, which means it's a two-way street. Both parties have duties and responsibilities to each other. So because this is an agreement, a bilateral agreement, we have to spell out those duties. We have to tell the seller, this is what I'm going to do for you. My number one duty is to find you a buyer. I'm going to express my best efforts to find you a buyer. I have a duty to disclose the terms of the offer. I have a duty to disclose material facts. I may provide other professional services. So if the seller needs advice for a, I don't know, a structural engineer, I might be able to make a recommendation versus them going to Google and finding something out there. We're going to learn professional services, vendors, as we go on in our career. Your firm very well may have a preferred vendor list to help you get started, to help you form these relationships with home inspectors, pest inspectors, surveyors, everybody we need in the transaction. The firm has a duty to provide the service to the listing services, to the MLS. Again, when I become a member of the MLS, that's one commitment I have to them, is that I've run all my listings through them. So we're going to let the seller know that we're going to put it in MLS. We talked the other day about the musts of our written agency agreements. And one of the musts is the non-discrimination clause. So our non-discrimination clause in our agency agreement says the agent, the firm, shall conduct all brokerage activities in regard to this agreement without respect to the race, color, religion, sex, national origin, handicap, or familial status of any property or prospective property. Further, realtors have an ethical duty to conduct such activities without respect to sexual orientation or gender identity of any party or prospective party. We must have our non-discrimination clause in all of our agency agreements. We're going to talk about the protected classes. We're going to identify all those protected classes, what that means to us. That's all coming up when we get to Unit 19. So we'll get into more detail. And then we're going to talk to the firm about how we're going to market the property. We signed the listing agreement today, but that doesn't mean I may be ready to get it on the market today, right? We enter into the agreement today, but I still got to gather data. I got to make arrangements to either measure it or have my guy come out and measure it. I got to make arrangements to take pictures or have my guy come out to take pictures, right? So just because we sign the paperwork today doesn't mean I'm ready to market it today. So the seller and the agent have a conversation about the date that we want to market it. When do we plan to put this in MLS? When do we plan to begin the marketing? And when it comes to marketing, we got a couple different choices. So we're either going to do what's known as public marketing, or I'm going to skip ahead for 1 second. We're going to do what's known as an office exclusive. I'm either going to put it out there to the public, or I'm only going to advertise it within the 4 walls of my office. Various reasons, conversations with the seller about why we may do an office exclusive. Most of the time, what we're going to see is public marketing, where we put it out there for the world to see, but we need to identify, it says it's right here, public marketing or office exclusive, but not both. If we're doing public marketing, are we going to put a for sale sign in the yard? Are we going to do open houses? Are we going to do internet advertising? Are we going to do advertising other than on the internet? So we're not just telling the seller, I'm going to market your property. We're telling the seller, this is what I expect to do. This is what I plan to do to market and advertise. Again, or we have the option of an office exclusive, just keeping it within our 4 walls of our office, not firm office. And then whether or not we're going to put a lockbox on the property. Seller does or does not authorize a lockbox. Seller acknowledgement's not highlighted. You may want to look this over, but pretty much what this says is that the seller acknowledges that, I have very limited control over Zillow. So what Zillow, for example, puts out there, there's only so much I can do about it. I mean, bottom line, I don't have control over the internet. So there may be some information out there that gets out there just by default, MLS feeding to various sites. I only have so much control over that. That's pretty much what we're talking about here. I get asked about this a lot. It may be a crime under federal and state law to listen to or record oral communication. If there is video, audio, or surveillance devices, sellers advise that no audio can be turned on during showings, open houses, etc., and that the placement of the video should not violate a visitor's reasonable expectation to privacy. So we have to have a conversation. Everybody's got some kind of system now. Anybody got Ring doorbell, right? So we need to have a conversation with the seller about they can't have audio without permission of the other party, without consent of the other party. We're going to see the same warning in our buyer's agency agreement. We'll talk about what that means for the buyer. But again, making sure that the seller's in compliance with these federal and state laws and turning their audio off. You can expect to be on video when you go into somebody else's home. I mean, guys, it's 2023. We need to conduct our lives as if we're on video anywhere we go, because you know what? There's a pretty good chance that we are. But they can't have audio. Earnest money, we're not going to say much about earnest money right now, because we're going to talk about that when we get to our sales contract. So we'll have the conversation about earnest money at that time. But the firm needs to acknowledge to the seller that they do or do not maintain a trust account, hold earnest money. Again, we'll talk about what that means, how that is applied, how that works, all that good stuff when we get to our contract in Unit 10. Then the seller has some representations to make to the firm. The seller has to share some information with the firm, such as ownership, how long they've owned the property, they are or are not under bankruptcy or contemplating bankruptcy. Is there access? Is it on a public or a private road? Is there a manufactured home on the property? Is it in an owner's association? If so, who is the owner's association? Who is the HOA? And how do we get in touch with them if need be? Is there flood insurance required? Is it located in a flood hazard? Is flood insurance required? Here's our synthetic stucco. Has the property been previously clad? Is there a termite bond on the property? Yes or no? Again, just asking the seller a bunch of questions. And then we need to talk to the seller about their current liens. We're going to ask the seller what liens they have on the property that they're aware of, first deed, mortgage on the property. And we need the seller to give us the approximate balance. Now, I'm not looking for down to the penny, but I need an idea. Because if the seller starts rattling off, well, I got this mortgage and a second mortgage and a third mortgage, and if you'll notice, here's a place for first mortgage, second mortgage, third mortgage, right? It gives us plenty of opportunities to ask the seller for their outstanding liens. And if all those liens start adding up and those liens exceed what you think you can sell the home for, we need to have a conversation, because that seller's underwater, which means they will need to bring money to the closing table. And we need to make sure early on that they can afford to do that. Would you guys, this is a hard conversation to have with somebody you just met, isn't it? Tell me what you owe, what's your debt on this house? But I ask you guys, would you rather have the hard conversation up front and determine that the seller can afford to sell, or go through the whole process, get to closing, the day before closing, tell the seller, you got to bring X amount tomorrow, and the seller say, yeah, I don't have that kind of money. If they don't have the money, they can't convey. If they can't convey, we got to terminate. So it's up to you guys. Hard conversation up front. Who's on board with that? Versus doing all that work, getting the whole way through the thing for the seller saying, I don't have that kind of money. What are you talking about? Have it up front, you guys. We're protecting our sellers and we're protecting ourselves. And this is why they give us this in the listing agreement, is to put those words in our mouths to help us have these conversations. So talking about liens. Are there any leases on the property? Are there any current leases on the property? So if they terminate that close to closing, is there any damage the seller needs to pay the firm? Well, clearly I've earned my commission if I'm the day before closing, right? We said the other day, there's a difference in when you earn your commission and when you actually get paid. So if the seller has to terminate the day before closing because they don't have the money, maybe the firm goes after them for the commission, maybe they don't. I mean, if the seller doesn't have any money, it's kind of hard to bleed a turnip, right? So it's up to the firm if they're going to go after the seller for that commission. I wish I could tell y'all they all close. I really do, but I'm not going to stand here and lie to y'all. Sometimes they don't close, and your firm has a decision to make. We've earned our commission. We brought them that ready, willing, and able buyer. Guess what? The buyer's agent earned their commission too, didn't they? We're the day before closing. We'd have to take them to court. The firm, excuse me, would have to take them to court. And that's up to the firm if they're going to do that or not. I know that's a hard pill to swallow, isn't it? Welcome to real estate. Let's see, leases on the property. There is or is not a lease. One of the agreement that was going to use. I don't understand that. I'm not following that one, Ezra. Let's see, are there special assessments from the HOA or from the government? Any outstanding special assessments? Is there a fuel tank on the property? We got a place to identify 2 tanks. It's currently in use or it's not. It's owned or it's leased. It's above ground, below ground. This is what's in it. So we address the fuel tanks, tank 1, tank 2, if on the property, is or is not on the property. So then the seller has duties and obligations to the firm. Remember, it's a two-way street. Firm has duties and obligations to the seller. Seller has duties and obligations to the firm. The seller's biggest responsibility is to cooperate with the firm in marketing and selling their property, allowing me to show it, allowing buyers to come in and see it. The seller also has a duty to complete several disclosures. Now, we're going to talk about disclosures next, so please bear with me. But we have a couple seller disclosures that they have a duty to provide. Lead-based paint or hazard addendum, if anything built prior to what year? Anybody remember the lead-based paint? 1978. You only have to know that year to get through your test. Once you get through your test, ta-da, they got it right there for you on the form. So anything built prior to 1978, the seller has a duty to provide that form, provide what they know about lead-based paint. Any HOA documents, they're going to provide us with HOA documents, any covenants, bylaws. owners association statements, and information about their title insurance policy, etc., etc. Seller has a duty to provide a general warranty deed. You can have that conversation. That's that fee simple marketable. Photographs and other materials, again, not highlighted, but I get asked about this a lot. So real quick, when I go to your home and take pictures, those pictures are my property. Yes, they're pictures of the seller's home, but that's my work, that's my property. So if I don't sell your home and our agency agreement expires and you hire another firm, that firm can't use my pictures. They need to go out and take their own. They need to go do their own work. Kind of fair, isn't it? It's called copyright in some places. So that's what that's addressing. So the question is, do we use this agreement in every closing? No, this is the agreement that we're using for the seller to hire the firm. The seller is hiring the firm, exclusive right to sell listing agreement. Remember, I cannot perform a single service for an owner without having a written agency agreement. And that's what we're doing here. We're creating agency so I can work, so I can list and market and sell your home. They may be in some kind of violation. I mean, you know, there's only so many angles of a room you can take a picture of. Mark, photography and real estate is, you know, some agents take their tripod and their cameras and they do a nice job. Other agents take their cell phone and don't even turn lights on, right? So, I mean, obviously some have different skills than others. I know what you guys may see out there on the websites. I'm telling you, our listing agreement says that the pictures are mine. You can't take my work. You can't take my property. I had a seller once and she had expired with another firm. And then I got the listing and it was like in the middle of winter. And the community she lived in had a pool. Well, obviously when I listed it, the pool was closed, right? It was shut down for the year. And when I listed her property, she said, man, the pool is, and it was a really nice pool. She said, it's such a selling point. She said, can't we just use so-and-so's pictures of the pool? I said, I can't. Well, I can send them to you. I can't do that because that's somebody else's property. So, I mean, you can only work with what you got, right? I'm not trying to take somebody else's work. Y'all make a note. Page 10 of our listing agreement starts talking about dual agency. This is dual agency as it's explained to the seller. What another great way to help us better understand dual agency. Another place for us to get that information. So we explain dual agency to the seller. We talk about disclosure of information, the firm's role as a dual agent. What does that mean to the seller? What's the seller's role if we were to go into a dual agency situation? We're going to explain designated dual agency. And then I'm going to minimize just a little bit so we can see everything on the same page here. Then we have authorization or direction. So either the seller authorizes the firm to act as a dual agent, or they want exclusive representation and they do not authorize the firm to dual agency. It's an either or. Yes, we'll consent to do dual. No, we want you just to represent us. We don't want to share you with the buyer in the transaction. If they agree to dual, if they say yes to dual and they initial these lines, then the seller needs to determine if they're okay with the same agent representing both parties. Some sellers may say, I'm okay with dual, but I don't want you on both sides. And if they say no to that, then that means another agent in the firm. Does that make sense? You'd have to have two agents in dual, two within the same firm. And then if we say yes to dual, and only if we say yes to dual, and if the firm offers it, if it's an option, then we get consent of whether or not we're going to do designated dual agency. So we got to get, I'm going to erase all this because there's a lot going on. We either got to get consent to dual or not. Everybody see that big or? That little word means a whole lot, doesn't it? So we got to agree to one or the other, either yes to dual or no. Somebody says it can complete up to 8 hours. The book says it can complete up to 8 hours to complete a listing agreement. I mean, again, you might be visiting that home several times before you're ready to market it, right? First, we got to get the listing, then we got to do the paperwork, we got to measure, we got to get data information, pictures. So, you know, that I'm thinking the book just gave you like as an example, but yeah, there's no set time. There's a lot of work that goes into getting a listing. There's a lot of work that we got to gather and do. I said, maybe you're making multiple trips out there. Remember, we talked about taking listings outside or taking clients outside of your, you know, if this listing's an hour away, are you willing to drive out there 3 times this week, right? So that's why we're focusing on our market. Where do you want to work? Where do you want to start? How far are you willing to drive? Some of us like driving better than others. I find driving therapeutic. Some of you do not. There's no formula to that. Other questions about this so far? I know it's a lot, you guys, and I know I'm going through it fast, and I see us starting to glaze over a little bit because I get forms are not the most exciting part about real estate. But do y'all want to know what a big part about real estate is? Forms. We got a cajillion of them. So we got to be familiar with the ones that we're going to use. Again, we're going through this quickly. We're not focusing on the whole thing just yet. We're easing you into it. So let's go take a break. I feel like we need to get up and do some jumping jacks, get another cup of coffee. When we come back, we'll finish our agency or listing discussion here. We're back. Okay, I am taking attendance. And, oh, Martha, let me do that again. You slid in there on me. I got you. There you go. A little bit more about our listing agreement. We talked about dual agency. There's got to be some kind of remedy for in the event of breach. What happens if either party breach? This is very common with contracts. You know, we enter into a contract as an agreement. The contract also has to spell out what happens if we don't honor our agreement. What happens if we break that promise? Most contracts are going to try to get you to mediation, have it settled in mediation versus going to trial. So this just kind of discusses what happens with those remedies. If a dispute arises, we're going to go to mediation. And then there's a wire fraud warning. And I'll let you guys read this, but I need everybody to understand that wire fraud has gotten really big, really fast in real estate. And what's happening is money is being intercepted by hackers going to or from the closing attorney. So if the buyer has to bring money to closing, they may choose to have that money wired in. If it gets hacked, it never makes it to the attorney. The seller may choose to have their proceeds after closing wire transferred to them. Again, if it gets intercepted by a hacker, then the seller's never going to get it. So we got to have a conversation with buyers and sellers, particularly those that plan on doing a wire transfer with the attorney. And bottom line, we need to look them in the eyeball and say, I will never email you wire transfer instructions. Never. And tell them if they do get an email from me with wire transfer instructions, I need to know, because that means I've been hacked and somebody is sending that out on my behalf, or it looks like it's on my behalf. Bottom line, if they want to do a wire transfer, the seller needs to call the closing attorney at a number that they independently obtained. Don't call them at a phone number and an email, because that phone number, that email could have been hacked. The phone number could be the hackers. So the seller needs to go old school, pick up the phone, call the attorney and say, what's your wire transfer? Or here's my wire transfer instructions in this case. We have a wire fraud warning to the seller in the listing agreement. We have a wire fraud warning to the buyer and the buyer's agency agreement. We have a wire fraud warning to both in our offer to purchase and contract. So we have several opportunities to have these conversations and protect our, in this case, sellers, and make sure they get their money after closing and it doesn't wind up in a offshore overseas account somewhere. Do I know anyone this has happened to? Not, luckily, not personally, but there was a wire fraud seminar a couple years ago. It was pre-COVID, but it was 2019, I think. Anyway, and they said the wire fraud seminar that there have been billions, that's with a B, billions of dollars intercepted from the real estate closing table. So it's something we all, and I don't ever want to know anybody that this has happened to, right? I don't want these, but it's absolutely something. It's one of the bigger things that we can do to help protect our clients, is make sure they understand. Don't rely on an email when it comes to this. So then we come down the last page here. I got place for 2 sellers to sign. So we're going to print their name, signature, and date. And then we got their contact information. If we need more than 2 sellers, if there's more than 2 sellers on the deed, 2 sellers that have to convey, we have something called an additional signatures addendum. So now we can add a piece of paper to it, that addendum to it, that allows me to get 8 more seller signatures. So now I have 10. There's 2 on here. 8 on the additional. If I need more than 10, I do as many additional signatures, addendum is what I need. Once again, you guys, I need everybody that has got to show up at closing to sign that deed to convey it, and their spouses to all be on board, all on day one. Because if one person doesn't show up on closing day, we can't convey, and game over. This is another one of these. Do you want to have the conversation up front, or you want to wait and be surprised on closing day? Pull the deed, know who has to sign, know who has to convey, and make sure you get everybody on board on day one, from day one. We also have a place here if the seller is an entity. So if they're a corporation or an LLC, we could sell it on, assist them as well. So there's their contact information. Then we have a place for the firm. So we're going to print the name of the real estate firm. The firm has a license number. All firms are licensed as well. The office address, and then the individual agent gets to sign it on behalf of the firm. So we sign the agency agreement on behalf of the firm. And because we sign it, we need to include our license number, that 6-digit license number, and then our contact information. Once that's all done, congratulations. You now have a seller client, and you now have a job. That job is to help them sell and market their home. Questions on our exclusive right to sell listing agreement? Again, it's a lot, and I get it. You're welcome to read. It's 13 pages. You're welcome to read it now. My suggestion is just to focus on the highlights. That's what we need to know at first. Let's start small and work big. Let's start small and work our way up. Focus on the highlights. Again, when you come to post licensing, we're spending a lot more time on this form. There's not much that we skip in post licensing with this form. And then as you're out with your firms will also spend time in your training. It's so important that we understand this form, so we're properly forming these relationships with our sellers. Questions or comments? Okay. Again, provisions, what we say, 216 over to 221. Help us better understand those various provisions. All right, I got a question for you guys. Set your private chats, A, B, C, or D. Did I hear from everybody? All right, so this one says all of the following are true of a listing agreement under the North Carolina Real Estate Commission rules, except, man, I wish we were Cahootin. I'd have had 100%. Good job, you guys. Good job. It's going to mention penalties. You know, again, that's just basic contract law. We talked the other day about some musts of our written agency agreement. One of them is that it must have a definite end date. It must have a termination date. The whole reason, or one of the reasons we put our agency agreements in writing, is so you can collect a commission. Please always remember, agency agreements are employment contracts. We're being hired to do a job. And when we're hired to do a job, we've got to discuss our commission. We've got to discuss how we expect to get paid. That's a big reason why we use these employment contracts. So the one thing I can never do is guarantee. Careful about making promises. You're going to try really hard to sell their home, but it's awfully hard to guarantee, right? I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't look into the future and tell you what buyer is going to buy it, if a buyer is going to buy it. What I can tell my sellers that I'm going to do everything that I possibly can to sell their home. Questions? All right, picking back up on page 221, we're going to talk about measuring. And particularly when we talk about measuring, we need to talk about what qualifies as heated living area, also known as total heated living area, total living square foot. What we're trying to define is what part of the home qualifies as this heated living area, this total living square foot. Please understand, not everything under the roof is going to qualify as heated living area. In order for me to count it as heated living area, we must have these three things, and all three things must be available. First off, it's got to be adequately heated by a permanently installed heating system. Permanently installed, you can't bring a space heater into a room and say, yeah, it's got heat. It's got to be permanently installed. And please note, this just says heat. Does that say AC? No, AC is a luxury. So we have to have heat in order to count it. The space has to be finished to generally accepted level of construction, which means it's got to be finished. We have to have finished floor, ceilings, walls. We can't be looking at studs. We can't be looking at insulation, right? It's a finished space. Ceilings have a restriction or limitation, I guess. In order for me to count it, the ceiling height has to be at least 7 feet. So ceiling height is 7 feet. I tell you what, you get into a home that's 100 years old or older. We were a lot shorter 100 years ago, weren't we? So you may have an old listing that may not meet these criteria. We'll talk a minute if it doesn't. And then the third criteria is it's got to be directly accessible from other heated living space. So in other words, you need to be able to go from room to room to room, a finished room with adequately heated system to a finished room with an adequately heated system. If you enter into a room that is not adequately heated or not finished, to get to another room, you can't count that other room. So for example, let's say you have a finished room over the garage. It's a finished room over the garage. It's adequately heated and it's finished. We call those frogs, by the way. Finished room over garage. Clever, hey? So to get to the stairs to access the frog, you have to walk through the unfinished basement. The basement's not heated, not the basement, I'm sorry, the garage. To get to the stairs, to get to the frog, you have to go through the unfinished garage. And because it's not directly accessible, I can't count that frog in my total heated living area criteria. Now I can market it. I can advertise the heck out of it. I can say there's an additional room over the garage that's another 450 square feet, but I can't include it in my total heated living area. You may have a room that's connected to the house by a breezeway. The breezeway has got to be adequately heated and finished in order to count that other room. Excuse me. I've been talking all week. I hope my voice lasts me till about 8:30 tonight. Then I'm pretty sure a nice glass of wine will help. So, so it's got to have all three of these things: adequately heated, finished, and directly accessible. It's about this time of class that I start getting a lot of questions from you guys, so hold off real quick. I get questions like, well, I have a space in my room that, you know, looks like this, this, and this. I can't attempt to answer it if I don't see it. But what I can let you do is go into that space in your room and ask yourself, is it adequately heated? Is it finished? And is it directly accessible? If so, you can count that space in your total heated living area. If not, then you can't. You can advertise it and promote it, but you can't count it in that total heated living area, that total heated square foot. So when it comes to determining square foot, square footage in North Carolina per the Real Estate Commission is not a material fact. Square footage, the Real Estate Commission, is not a material fact, but if we advertise it, we're responsible for it. We're liable for the accuracy of it. Some MLSs require it. Your test is not going to ask you about the Triad MLS. Your test is going to ask you about the North Carolina Real Estate Commission. So the commission says it's not a material fact. Yes, in the Triad MLS, we at least have to put that total heated. Again, we'll talk about measuring in just a second. You may want to choose to add room dimensions. Tell us how big the kitchen is, living room, dining room, all the bedrooms. That's one way that we can use to help describe the property. Buyers may look at that to determine if their furniture will fit in the room, if they have large furniture, for example. So it is helpful in advertising, but the room dimensions are never going to be required. Again, what we're referring to is the total heated square footage. We can't rely on other sources. We can't look up the square footage in the tax record and rely on that. Those things are very rarely right anyway. We can't rely on builders' blueprints. We can't rely, once again, on somebody else's work. If another agent or another firm previously listed it, we cannot rely on what they advertised. When we're advertising square footage, we're either learning how to do it and going out measuring ourselves, or we're hiring somebody with more experience than us. What I mean by that is you can't hire the 16-year-old down the street to measure your home. If you're hiring somebody to do it, you're hiring an experienced agent or an appraiser. You guys with me? Somebody that knows what they're doing. But please listen to me, because you need to make sure who you hire, because no matter who does the work, you are the listing agent and you are responsible for it. So you want to make sure the person you hire knows what they're doing. I honestly, all the agents I know, I could probably put them 50-50. Half of them measure their own, half of them hire someone. It's a personal decision for you guys. I'll show you a resource in just a second where you can learn more about measuring. Again, just trying to keep you focused on what we need to know for our test. I got a really good question in the chat. What if we're looking at unpermitted space? Remember, we talked about unpermitted space back in unit 6, I think. I don't know, previous unit. I can count unpermitted space in my total heated square footage as long as it meets those 3 criteria. And I disclose that that space is unfinished. I can count it. It's got to meet the 3. And I have to disclose that that was unpermitted space. Thank you. For the most part, brokers working with buyers should be able to rely on the information that's in the MLS. When the listing agent says this is the square footage and you're working with a buyer, you should be able to rely on that unless you have a red flag go up. I don't know. I've never measured this room. I really need to one day because I use an example all the time. But let's just pretend that this room is 400 square feet. And we advertise it, excuse me, we advertise this room as 400 square feet. If it's actually 420, the average eye can't walk into this room and say, oh, clearly this is 20 square feet off, right? It's so close. The average eye can't see that. But if I advertise it as 400 and it's actually 700, the average eye should be able to say, that doesn't look like 400 square feet. Does that make sense? If it's that big of a discrepancy, we should be able to throw up our little red flag. If your little red flag goes up, or if your buyer has any questions, measure the space. Run out to your car and grab your tape measure, or better yet, I got a toy when I went into sales. Santa brought me a tool, and it's a laser measurer. It's so dang cool. You hold it up to the wall, you point the laser to the other wall, and you hit click, and it tells me how many feet and inches it is from here to that wall. Length times width equals square foot, right? So I do this way, and then I go to this wall, hold it up, point my laser, click. Now I have the length and the width of this room, and I can determine the square footage. It probably took me longer to go to my car and get my laser measurer than what it did to actually measure this room. But if you have a red flag that goes up, or if your buyer says, are you sure this is only 400? Now we have a duty to verify that and make sure it's right. A question comes in, is it the broker's responsibility to hire or pay somebody to determine square footage? Generally, you may want to have a conversation with the seller, but generally speaking, it is the broker's responsibility, the firm's. We are responsible for marketing and advertising. Your firm may have a policy where we ask the seller to pay for it. Remember that competitive listing? Katrina went this morning and I'm going this afternoon. Katrina says, I'll handle measuring. Julie says, I demand you pay half of it. Who looks better to the seller, right? So it could be a negotiation point. The other thing that to consider, and something that the appraiser will look at, we're not necessarily having a, we're not necessarily responsible for identifying above grade and below grade, but we need to be aware of it because the appraiser is going to consider above grade and below grade. Now, remember, I got a whole unit dedicated to the appraiser, so we'll talk about them in unit 17. Below grade property tends to have less value than above grade. So when we mean by below grade is something that one side touches earth. So you guys see my house here, and we got the first floor, and then down here we got a basement. This whole side touches earth, which means that basement level is below grade. If any portion of it touches earth, it's below grade, and the appraiser is not going to put as much value on below grade as above grade. Again, that's not my job to determine value. That's the appraiser's, but it's certainly worth having a conversation with the seller and the buyers because we know that's something the appraiser will consider. So hold your place in the book. And if you will, flip back with me to page 743. Let's go to 743 together. $743 is Appendix C. And this is our residential square footage guidelines. Now, probably when you join your firm, you'll get a nice, pretty glossy brochure with this information. But right now we got Appendix C in your book. Let's go ahead and call Appendix C as your measuring Bible. When you guys are learning how to measure, when you guys are learning how to do this, this is your resource, which is probably why your firm will provide it for you. To help you for your test, I want you guys just to look at 744 and 745. 744 and 745 talks about the things that we just discussed. That little gray box on 744 talks about above grade and below grade. And then you got your living area criteria, the 3 things that are required. It talks about under number 2, it talks about the ceilings being at least 7 feet tall. If you're in an attic that is finished and directly accessible and heated, and the attic has slope ceilings, those slope ceilings have to be at least 5 inches. So they do give us a little. I got a question, does the basement count as total heated square footage? The basement would have to be heated, finished, and directly accessible. It's always got to have those 3 things in order to be counted. So we go over those 3 things. Over on page 745, it talks about specifics, like does the attic count? There's that bay window. Y'all remember when we talked about the trapezoid in unit 4? So there's that bay window, just various things. Again, for your test, let's focus on 744 and 745. The rest of Appendix C is for after you pass. So it gets more into details, it gets into more information. And I particularly like starting on page 750. It actually gives you measurements, breakdowns of individual floor plans. So we have a 1-story with a basement. 752, we have a 2-story. 754 is a 2-story with a bonus, split foyer on 756, etc. So it almost serves as like a little workbook to help us understand and get and make sure the different floor plans and we're properly counting the square footage. Again, for your test, what you need to know for now is 744 to 745. You're going to spend more time on measuring when you get to post licensing. And I'll tell you right now, the easiest way to learn how to measure a house is go do it. As a brand new agent, if you're going to go out and measure it, the broker in charge, if they know they have an experienced agent that is going to measure a listing and they know what they're doing, they may send you to shadow the experienced agent, right? They may send you to watch. The first time you measure your own listing, I hope somebody's with you to make sure to help guide you through. Every house is different. So it's all with those three criteria: heated, finished, and accessible. Is it better to find a good appraisal for not getting a mistake? Do you know how much an appraisal costs for this? I don't. I've never hired an appraiser. I actually have a general contractor on my team. So that's a good guy to have on speed dial, by the way. But he does all our measuring. And the houses I've measured, he's been with me, and he's tough. He will not help me at all. I hear stuff like, well, Julie, what do you think? I want your opinion. So I don't know how much it costs. I'm sure everybody's different. It's just something you need to, I'm not talking about the appraisal, you guys. I'm talking about hiring somebody to measure, hiring somebody to help you with that. We're going to talk about the appraisal when we get to unit 17. It's a decision you guys need to make, but what do we need to know before you can make that decision? Either you do it yourself or you hire somebody. You make that decision once you get your license. Don't put your cart in front of your horse. We still got to get you there. Fair enough? So if you were measuring, let's say, just real quick, real general, let's say you were measuring this house. So we have a nice square house. And let's say that this house has, I don't know, garage out from it, right? So you got the house, and then you got this extra little piece with the garage. What I mean, not everything under the roof qualifies. So most garages don't have those 3 criteria. Most garages are not heated. Most garages are not finished. If they are, and they're directly accessible, then you can count them. But generally speaking, when we measure, we always start outside to measure and then come in and deduct what doesn't count. So if I were measuring this house, I would take my measuring tape and I would walk outside from corner to corner to corner, right? I would measure this home. I would go outside and get my measurements and get everything under the roof And then I would go in and deduct what doesn't qualify, what doesn't meet those 3 criteria. And that's what's going to give me my total heated living area. So we start big, we start with everything under the roof, and then we go in and deduct what doesn't count, what doesn't qualify. It's a lot of work. But I tell you, the more you do, the easier it gets. I swear that first house I measured with my general contractor, I measured, he didn't help me. I swear we were there all day. I didn't think I was ever going to get done. But we got through it. The next one was a little faster. The one after that was a little faster. It comes with time. So again, you have choices. So what I want to do now, I need to stop sharing this for 1 second. So everybody bear with me. I have a little video I want to share with you guys. This is a video on measuring. This video is from the Winston-Salem Board of Realtors. So they partnered up with Piedmont Federal Bank, and they made this video a couple years ago. This video does a nice job of introducing us to the idea. Introducing us to the idea of measuring. I think there's a little bit more in the video than what you need to know. This is a longer video. I know there's more in here than what you guys need to know, but I also know that it covers what you do need to know. So I think it's a good video. I do want us to see it. I'll try to remember, I may need your help, but I'll try to remember to put this link in the chat. So if you want to look at the video later, you'll have this video link available. So let's go out. No, that's not what I want. There it is. So here's our video. Y'all give me the thumbs up when I start that you can hear it, so we know.
Home Measurement Fundamentals is brought to you by the Winston-Salem Regional Association of Realtors and Piedmont Federal Savings Bank. Any discussion of a home starts with 2 fundamental questions. The first, of course, is, where is it? That question is always closely followed by, how large is it? As you probably know, that's a really important question, and it's the subject of this video series. There are 5 videos overall, with this video tackling the details of what space or square footage should be included. The remaining 4 videos show you how to apply what you will learn in this video to homes of varied construction and architectural styles. There are a number of fundamentals that will impact your work in measuring any home regardless of its style. Let's get started. The valuation of a residential property is directly impacted by the size of the house. Potential homeowners make decisions based on the sizes of homes they are considering. An inaccurate home measurement can lead to a valuation that is wrong, and to incorrect decisions being made by potential homeowners who rely on those measurements. No one wants that, of course. Calculating the accurate size of a home requires a disciplined and technical process. The size or portion of a home that matters most is its living area. This is sometimes called heated living area or heated square footage. A clear understanding of what is and is not included within the living area of a home is critical. The living area of a home is the space that will be occupied by the homeowner. As you've probably guessed, the living area does not include all of the space that is under the roof of the home. First off, the living area must be heated with a permanently installed heating system that makes the space suitable for living year-round. Neither a portable heater nor a fireplace is considered permanent heating sources. In addition, the living area must be finished with walls painted and floors covered. The living area must also have a ceiling height of at least 7 feet, except under beams and ducts where the ceiling height must be at least 6 feet 4 inches. When a room has sloped ceilings, such as those often found in bonus rooms and finished attic spaces, the area of a room with a ceiling height of at least 5 feet can be included in the living area of the home, so long as at least half of the room's square footage has a ceiling height of at least 7 feet. The living area must also be directly accessible from other living areas via a doorway, heated hallway, or stairway. If a space within the home is heated, finished, and directly accessible from other living areas, it counts as a living area, and its square footage is included. Questions sometimes arise regarding whether to include a number of special areas and architectural spaces within the living space of the home. Let's run through a number of those now. Assuming that these spaces meet the criteria of heated, finished, and directly accessible from other living areas, then the following spaces can be included within the living area of the home. Attics. Again, if they meet the living area criteria, then they do count. But keep in mind the ceiling height requirements we mentioned earlier. Also, be sure to note that this space is in the attic in the listing notes for the home. Many attics will not meet the living area requirements, but some will. Basements. Remember that the space must be finished. And again, keep the ceiling height requirements in mind, as well as the need to be directly accessible from other living areas of the home. If the basement is included in living space, make note that the space is below grade or is a basement space. Bay window areas. If the space has a finished floor and ceiling height of at least 7 feet, it counts as living area. Bonus rooms, also called finished rooms over the garage, they count. Just keep the ceiling height requirements in mind. Chimney. The space for the chimney base counts as living area if it is located inside the living area. If the chimney base is outside of the living area, then it does not count. If the hearth is included inside the living area, then include the space for the hearth. Stairs. If the stairs connect living area spaces, include the area of the stairs with the area of the floor from which the stairs descend. If the opening for the stairway exceeds the length and width of the stairway, subtract the excess space from the upper floor and include it with the lower floor, regardless of the ceiling height under the stairs. Furnace and mechanical rooms. For simplicity, if these spaces are located within the living area of the home, they are included, even if the living area criteria are not met. Hallways, closets, dormers, offices, storage rooms, and laundry rooms, they're all included if they meet the living area criteria. Spaces within the home that do not meet the living area criteria should not be included within the square footage of the living area, but should be mentioned in the listing data for the home. These would include areas such as unfinished basements, unfinished attics, and unfinished bonus rooms. Decks, balconies, porches, garages, and carports should not be included in finished or unfinished area calculations for the home, but are noted for information purposes. At this point, you have a good idea of what should and should not be included in the living area of the home. Let's take a look at the tools you will use. You will need a few things to complete a home measurement project, including a 100-foot tape measure, a 30-foot retractable tape measure, some graph paper. 10 square graph paper is best, where 10 by 10 squares equal an inch, a camera, you can use the one on your phone of course, and a clipboard. A laser distance meter is also helpful and can speed up the process, especially with interior measurements. Homes are measured in feet and tenths of a foot rather than feet and inches, so it is best to get a 100-foot tape with increments in tenths of a foot. Or you can simply convert your measurements into tenths of a foot using conversion tables, which can be found online. You may also want to have a screwdriver with you. More on that in a later video. There are apps and software that can be used to aid the measurement process, and many of them are quite good. For our purposes here, we will be demonstrating the measurement and calculation of home spaces without apps or software. If you know how to do the work without those aids, you will be much more proficient if you choose to incorporate those apps into your process. Either way, you'll be doing the measurements manually, and thinking through what areas count as living area and what areas do not. In the next video in the Home Measurement Fundamentals series, we'll take what we have learned and use it to measure a ranch-style home with a basement. We'll pay particular attention to the overall process used to correctly measure a home. Later videos in this series will demonstrate the measurement of split-level, 1 and 1.5 story, and 2-story homes. We encourage you to watch all 5 of the videos in the Home Measurement Fundamentals series to develop a full understanding of the process used for accurate results. Home Measurement Fundamentals is brought to you by the Winston-Salem Regional Association of Realtors and Piedmont Federal Savings Bank. Live local, bank local.
Okay, so again,
Home Measurement Fundamentals is
there, as she mentioned, it's a 5-part series. So I'm going to send you guys the link. I'll put it in the chat when we go on to break. But once you view the video, then you can, find the other ones. I wouldn't worry about the other ones right now. You may even not, again, there's more in the video we just watched than what you need to know. But I hope it did kind of a good job of introducing you to this idea of measurement. And it reinforces some of the things that you do need to know for your test, such as what we see on 744 and 745. One thing that the video mentioned that I do want to point out, we may be measuring space that we can't get to outside. So for example, if you have a 2-story home and you got the first floor here, and then the second floor is bigger than the first floor, I can measure the first floor outside from the ground, right? I can take my tape measure and run around the first floor. I can't safely get to the outside of the second floor and measure it, can I? I don't want you guys up on a ladder trying to measure a house. So when we come into situations like this, where we can't get to the outside of a space, the rule says, the guidelines tell us that in that case, in the second floor, we're actually going to go inside and measure the exterior walls inside. What I mean by an exterior wall, with an exterior wall on the other side is outside, versus an interior wall where the other side is another room or a hallway or something, right? So we're going to go up to the second floor in this case. We're going to measure inside, and then we're going to add 6 inches. And that's going to allow us to count for that wall space. That's going to be as close as what we can get to if we were to measure it outside. There is one exception to that, and that exception is condos. Condo owners don't own outside. So condos are always measured inside, exterior walls measured inside, and you don't have to add 6 inches because the owner only owns inside. The owner only owns paint to paint. It's a lot, I know. Let's just focus on what we need to know, get you through the test first. Like I said, we're spending way much more time on measuring when you get to post-licensing your firm. And, you guys don't make the decision today, but you guys need to explore your options and figure out which one is best for you. I know some agents are so uncomfortable with their measuring and math skills, they don't want to do it themselves and risk putting that wrong information out. Some feel better with it. Some are willing to learn, save that money to pay somebody to do it and do it themselves. It all comes down to time versus money. So it's a decision for you guys to make, of course. Do I have any questions on measuring? Particularly what counts as residential square footage? Yeah.
So I just want to make sure I understand. I'm sorry. So just to clarify, we don't have to know how to precisely measure for the test. I mean, I trust my math instincts, but I just.
You don't have to measure anything for your test, right? What do we need to know about the test? The 3 things: directly accessible, finished, and heated. And then,
Right.
above grade, below grade, right? Yeah, no, you
Right.
don't have to measure a house for your test.
Okay.
You do have to measure for post licensing. You get a homework assignment. Now, let me rephrase that. You get a mandatory homework assignment in post licensing. So you get to worry about that then. Yep. All right. Take a break. We come back, we keep going. These 10-minute breaks go by fast, don't they? It's another reason why I like the timer, because it's easy to challenge. Julie, are you sure that was 10 minutes? Well, that's what the timer said. I question it myself sometimes. Did everybody see the link to the video we just watched? Everybody get that in the chat. If you want to grab it and watch it, great. If not, you don't have to. I'm just making it available for you. So it looks like we're back. Cameras are on. I'm seeing you. So I'm going to take attendance. And get back in. So we're still working with sellers. We've helped determine the square footage, heated area square footage. Another big thing in working with sellers, another big discussion that we need to have with sellers before we list, before we sign the listing agreement, is to help them determine an appropriate listing price. Help them determine an appropriate listing price. We can help them determine that by performing what's known as a comparative market analysis, or a CMA. And when we do a CMA, it's a program we can use through the MLS. It's, you know, clickety click, and it'll help you generate the report, click, gather the information. We're looking at like areas or homes, properties nearby that have recently closed. And we're going to use those properties nearby that have recently closed to help us arrive at an opinion of what we think this seller's probable sales price is going to be. The appraiser gets to use the word value. Unless you're a licensed appraiser, we can't look at a seller and say, I think this is the value of your home. What you and I do is look at the seller and say, based on my CMA, I think your probable sales price is. We will look at CMAs when we get to Unit 17. So we're going to talk about what the appraiser does, and then we're going to look specifically on our portion, the CMA, and even compare the two. The CMA is not an appraisal. They're generated for two different things. So we'll talk more about this. As we mentioned earlier, when we were looking at our listing agreement, I mean, I got to have everything filled in before I ask the seller to sign the contract, but we have to have a definite list price determined. Do not put in to be determined. Don't put in about X amount. We need a definite list price. We all need to make sure we're on the same page when we list it. Another thing that we want to consider when we're helping the sellers is another strategy that you may encounter once you get licensed. But another thing we're going to study with the market is how many days on markets, how many days were homes nearby advertised? How many days were they on the market before they went under contract? And by studying that days on market, what's the average days on market, that's going to do stuff like help us determine how long to have the listing agreement for. So we can have, fill that in. Are we going to do it for, last year it was a lot shorter because homes in some cases were going under contract within hours of being put on the market. Days on market were a lot shorter last year. We're starting to see those days on market go back up. So there's a lot to look into before we start filling in those blanks in the listing agreement. Again, spending more time on CMAs when we get to Unit 17. As listing agents, we have a duty, always have a duty, not just listing agents, always have a duty to avoid conflict of interest. And one example of conflict of interest is if you, the agent, want to sell your own personal property. You are one of the people on the deed. You can wear two hats in that transaction. You can act as the seller and the listing agent. I wouldn't hire another agent to sell my house. I'm not going to pay somebody else to sell my house. I'm going to act as the seller and the agent in this transaction. What we need to understand is that we always have this duty to avoid a conflict of interest. And if I'm listing property that I own, I cannot represent the buyer in that transaction. Let's think this through. My name is on the deed. And when that buyer hires me, I'm looking at them, promising them old car. I'm promising that I have their best interest in mind. But guys, let's be honest. If my name's on the deed, whose best interest do I actually have? Mine, all day long. Can we see the obvious conflict of interest here? I can let another agent in my firm represent the buyer, but I can't represent that buyer in this transaction. There is an exception. All good rules have an exception. The exception to this is if it's a commercial listing, it's a commercial property that you own, that you're listing for sale, and you own, your ownership is less than 25%. If you own commercial property, your ownership is less than 25%, you may be able to represent the buyer in that transaction. You need to go into it with full disclosure, and you need to get the buyer's consent. You need to let that buyer know that you have a 24.3% interest. So all good things need to come to an end, and that includes our listing agreements, our listing contracts. We saw this list back in Unit 7. This is a duplicate. Now we're going to talk about it again, just as it relates to the listing agreement. How our listing agreements end? Well, once we get them to closing, once I've done the job that I was hired to do. So let's say, for example, we're going to closing today. Today's closing day. Almost always a good day. So we're going to closing today, but our agency agreement isn't over until the end of February. Our agency relationship is going to end today because I've done the job. It's complete. I don't owe you anything until the end of February. We're done. So closing will terminate our agency, specifically our listing agreement. Expiration date, we know that all agency agreements have to have a definite end date. When they're over, they're over. Of course, we can agree to extend them, but there's nothing to make anybody extend it. Mutual agreement. The parties can agree to get out of the listing agreement. Think this through. The parties agreed to get in to the listing agreement, didn't they? The buyer and the seller and the firm agreed to get into the listing agreement together. So flip that coin, they can agree mutually to get out. It's not up to you, the individual agent, if you're going to agree to release this seller from their listing agreement. Who's it up to? It's up to your firm. So your broker in charge, your firm would have to be the one to do the mutual agreeing with the seller. If either party breaches, if they don't do the duties and obligations that they promised each other, that could terminate the listing agreement. Operation of law. If the judge takes the property for any reason, bankruptcy, foreclosure, adverse possession, it's no longer the seller's to sell. If the judge takes the property, the seller's no longer on the deed. They don't have the right to sell it. So operation of law, destruction of property. If the house burns down while you have it listed. And then death or incapacity of either party, remembering that the agreement is between the seller and the firm. If the individual agent passes away, or if the individual agent's license goes inactive, the show goes on. If the firm closes their doors, or if the firm loses their license, then that would terminate. Or if the seller passed away, that would terminate the listing agreement. Questions? Something else to discuss when we're working with sellers, listing agents when we're working with sellers. The seller's required to complete and provide a couple disclosures. So us as listing agents can help the sellers with their disclosures. These are seller disclosures. The guidelines for these disclosures fall under the North Carolina Residential Property Disclosure Act. And this act covers several different disclosures. The first one we're going to talk about is the Residential Property Owners Association Disclosure Statement. For simplicity, are you guys good if I call it the RPODs going forward? That's a mouthful. I would trip over my words every single time. So the Residential Property Owners Association Disclosure Statement, or the RPODs, is a seller disclosure. When I stress seller disclosure, I mean this is a form that the seller has to complete. I cannot do it for them. Most sellers of residential property is required to complete the RPODs. There are several exceptions. The biggest exception, the most noteworthy exception, is residential sellers of new construction. So never before lived in dwellings. And what the seller is doing with this form is disclosing various information about the property. We're going to look at this form in just a second. Who remembers caveat emptor? What's caveat emptor mean? Buyer beware. Shake your head, yes or no. Does the seller have to disclose? Do they have to? No, caveat emptor says they don't. This is what makes this form interesting. It's a mandatory form, which means the seller has to provide it, but they have the option if they want to disclose or not. They're going to be at, it's like a page and a half of questions about the property. And the seller has, are there problems with the property? The roof, the foundation, the plumbing, a page and a half of these kinds of questions. And the seller has three choices. They can either say, yes, there's a problem, no, there's not a problem, or no representation. I'm not telling you yes, I'm not telling you no. I'm exercising my right under caveat emptor and choosing not to disclose. A mandatory form with optional disclosure. Keep in mind, I think just to clarify, we said most sellers, an exception is never before lived in dwellings. Please understand the for sale by owner of a resale is required to do the RPODs as well. So you as the buyer's agent may be assisting the buyer by having the seller complete that. We'll talk more about that. So mandatory form, caveat emptor says optional disclosure. The RPODs is the seller's responsibility to complete. I can help them. I can put the form in their hand. I can have a conversation with them about it. I can assist them, but I can't do it for them. Y'all, I never lived in that house. I don't know about the plumbing and the structural and the roof. There's a very good chance I just saw this home for the first time yesterday or a week ago, right? I can't attest to the conditions of the property. I cannot complete it before them. This is a seller disclosure. And we need to keep the RPODs accurate throughout the listing. So if the seller disclosed that something was broke or something wasn't working, and then they fix it, we need to update the RPODs. If the seller discloses that, no, this isn't broke, it's no problem, and then it breaks, we need to update the RPODs. This is what I mean by keeping it current. We talked earlier last week, about the disciplinary action from the Real Estate Commission. And we talked about one thing they'll do is put your name and firm and what you did and that happened to your license. All that goes out to the e-bulletin every month under the disciplinary actions. I'm telling you what I've saw a lot, what I'm seeing a lot here lately is agents' failure to keep these things updated. Something broke and then was fixed. We didn't update the RPOs. Something worked and then broke and we didn't update the RPOs. So this second is a very real life thing that's coming up quite a bit. So it's the seller's responsibility to complete. All agents in the transaction are responsible from delivering it, from getting it from the seller to the buyer. Now, the majority of the time, when you log into MLS and you have that back end stuff that the public can't see, another thing we have is a place to upload attachments. So when you look at 123 Main Street, most of the time you'll be able to click on the attachment, see the RPOs and the other seller disclosures. If it's a for sale by owner, the buyer's agent is responsible for getting the completed RPOs from the seller to the buyer. Either way, we got to get a copy of this in the buyer's hands. That's what this is about. Failure to put this in the buyer's hands, failure for the seller to complete this and give this to the buyer, once we go under contract, could result in a buyer's right to cancel. They could terminate their contract. If they put down any deposits, they'll get their money back. We have to have it to the buyer either within the end of the third day following the buyer's receipt or the end of the third day following contract date, whichever one happens first. The buyer has this 3-day window if they don't have it to terminate. Please understand, they can't terminate because they don't like how it was completed. They can't terminate because the seller said no representation. Their right to terminate is because they didn't receive it. It's a mandatory form with optional disclosure. If you have like a tenant purchasing the home that they've been lived in, then this form a lot of times may be waived. That may be a case. If you had a tenant living there for 12 years, the tenant knows about the home better than the owner, right? So if they're going to buy it now, we did a lease to own, for example. So settlement or occupancy, if that happens first, then that's going to end the mandatory requirement to disclose the form or provide the form. The Disclosure Act does fall under a commission rule. Again, you don't need to memorize this number. I simply put it here for reference. If you want to look it up, you can, 58A.0114. Once again, the ones that I really, really want you guys to read, I have in the Campbell folder of the online learning system. So the RPOs is one disclosure that falls under the Residential Property Disclosure Act. See, Residential Property Disclosure Act, the RPOs is one disclosure. The other seller disclosure that falls under this act is the mineral and oil and gas disclosure that we affectionately refer to as the MOG. Who remembers Unit 2? Let's go way back in time. And we started talking about severing your subsurface rights. You can sell those subsurface rights. You can lease those subsurface rights. The seller has got to disclose if they have severed the subsurface rights or they intend to sever the subsurface rights. This comes back to bottom line. A buyer deserves to know what they're buying. And if they're buying a property and they don't have the rights to the minerals, the oils, or the gases in their subsurface of their property, they have a right to know that. The seller needs to disclose that status. Look at that form as well in just one second. The MOG does apply to new construction. The MOG does not apply to the sale of vacant land. So that would be the exception to the MOG. Because the law The Residential Property Disclosure Act only covers residential property. It doesn't cover the sale of land. So we will see a MOG with new construction. We won't see a MOG with vacant land. The MOG falls under 58A.0119 Commission Rule. Again, don't need to know these numbers. I just put it here for reference. Check it out if you wish. So there is a sample RPOS and MOG in your book. I honestly have no idea if that's the current version in your book or not. I don't know. But what I do know is in the online learning system, we got the current version. So in the Unit 8 material, first up, we have our RPOs. You need a magnifying glass to read this thing, by the way. If you were to print it out, hold it in your hand. Anybody sold a house lately? Try to read this thing, look it through. So the RPOs starts with instructions to the property owners, and it tells the property owners about their options of checking yes, no, or no representation. If you do check yes or no and something happens, we ask that you do a new disclosure statement. So once again, the form helps us put words in our mouths when we're having these conversations with the sellers. Note to the buyer, the form addresses to the buyer their rights to cancel if they don't receive it. Again, they can't cancel because they don't like the way it's complete. But if they don't receive it, if they don't have it, they have that 3-day window to cancel. Then we have the property address with the owner's name. The owner sign it, the owner completes it, and the owner signs it. We put it in MLS with our listing. A buyer comes through and makes an offer. And with their offer, we include the RPOs with the buyer's signature. The buyer has signed acknowledging receipt. So we couple it all together with our offer paperwork, get the buyer to sign everything so we can present a complete offer. And then starting on page 2, we start asking the seller, or it starts asking the seller a whole bunch of questions about the home. And I'll let you guys look through this because it's pretty detailed. But what I want us to focus on right now, of all these questions, the seller has 3 choices. They have the right to say, yes, something's broke. No, this isn't broke, or no representation. Maybe no representation means they don't know if something works or not. Maybe no representation means they're honoring caveat emptor. They're choosing to run those rules and not disclose. Maybe no representation means it's a shady seller that's trying to hide something. Buyers are always encouraged to have home inspections, no matter how this is complete. Keeping in mind the seller's never under any obligation to disclose. So the seller goes through, again, I'll let you guys look at this, various things, you know, here's the roof. Is there any leakage, water leakage? Is there any defects with the plumbing system? What's the sewage disposal system? I mean, on and on, a page and a half of questions just about the property for the seller to complete. If the seller answers yes to any of the above, yes, something's broke, or yes, something doesn't work, then they're asked to explain what's broke, specifics. The rest of this is in the event that the property is in an owner's association. Is it in an HOA? If it's not, we don't have to worry about it. But if it is, then the seller needs to make some representations, such as who is the owner's association, what's all their contact information. We need to let the buyer know what the HOA dues are. Are they X amount per month, per year, per quarter, whatever? Help give them specifics there. And then the seller, again, HOA information, and then the seller can tell if they choose, they can represent to the buyer the various things that their HOA dues may cover. So when you pay X amount per month into an HOA, what do you get? Again, optional disclosure. If there is no HOA, then there's nothing to disclose here. 4 pages. Residential property and owner association disclosure statement, seller disclosure, seller form. Questions on that one? The other one then here is the MOG, the mineral and oil and gas rights. This one's only 1 page. Again, it starts with instruction to the property owners, their liability to complete the form, their options to complete the form. I'm going to say it depends. It could raise it, it could harm it, right? It just, there's no rhyme or reason to that. Some people have more value in it than others, being an independent thing. So we have instructions to the property owners, what they need to know to complete this form. Again, this is a seller disclosure, something that I cannot disclose for them. We're going to make sure everybody understands what we mean about mineral and oil and gases and the rights to disclose. And then we have the actual disclosures. And the best way to see this form is to kind of cut this in half. So the first section, the top section here, we are asking the seller about the mineral rights. And first, we're going to ask if the mineral rights were severed from the previous owner. Yes, no, or no representation. The seller may not know if they were severed from the previous owners. Then we're going to ask if the seller has severed or if the seller intends to sever. And their only options here are yes or no. They cannot not disclose if they have severed or if they intend to sever before we get to closing. Does that make, that's really fair, isn't it? They cannot not disclose that. And then we go through that same little exercise again, only this time with the oil and gas rights. So we're kind of going through it once. Once have you severed the minerals, once have you severed the oil and the gas rights. If your seller has severed, if they say yes to any of these, you look at your buyer and you say, let's call our attorney. Because once you start severing subsurface rights, that just got really legal really fast. So we need to make sure that your buyer is properly represented, make sure that your buyer knows what they're getting. The rest of this one, note to purchasers, again, explaining their right to cancel if they don't receive this form. Property address, owner signs it, or owner name, owner signs it. We load it in MLS. Buyer buys the property. We're ready to present the offer. Now the buyer signs acknowledging receipt. Questions on our RPOs or MOG? Anybody bought a house lately? You see these things? Part of all your paperwork. I know when you buy a house, when you sell a house, all that paperwork runs together. Okay. Again, they're in your books. I don't think they're out of date. They don't update that often. But I think it's just easier if we get in the habit of looking forms up in the online learning system. And then that way we don't have to question, is this the current or is this the not? I know what I got in the online learning system is the current. Caveat emptor. Questions? So when it comes to the North Carolina Residential Property Disclosure Act, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for the broker? Well, we always have a duty to disclose material facts, regardless of how the seller completes it. The seller has the right to say no representation. But once we learn about a material fact, we must disclose it. So if the seller says the roof leaks, shh, don't say anything. I'm going to say no representation. We still have a duty to disclose that, guys. Please always remember, we follow our clients' lawful instructions. And asking me to not disclose a material fact is not an instruction I can follow. They get to hide behind caveat emptor. The seller gets to hide behind caveat emptor. I have to follow license law and commission law. Somebody says if they say no representation, how do we know it's a fact or a lie? There's where the buyer's agent comes in. The buyer's agent is always going to encourage the buyer to have a home inspection. You know, the buyer's going to do their inspections and investigations to learn about the property on their own. And that's what caveat emptor says. The seller doesn't have to disclose. The onus is on the buyer to learn about the property. Do sellers lie sometimes? Do sellers hide stuff when they know darn well it's broke and the roof leaks? Yeah. The only way, the best way for the buyer to protect themselves is to do their own investigations and inspections. Again, we all have a duty, all agents in the transaction have a duty to make sure that this completed form gets put in the hands of the buyer. Doesn't matter how I get it to them. I just gave you guys MLS attachment as an example, and probably the most common delivery method, but there is no rule about how we get it to them. We could email it to them. We could drive it to their house, right? There is no rule about how. I just used MLS because that's in practice the most common method. If you look at a listing in MLS and that RPOs and the MOG haven't been loaded and they're required for that property, you need to get on the phone with the listing agent and ask them to send it to you. We all have a duty to put that in the buyer's hands. Questions? So we've talked about working with sellers, talked about helping them getting the information we need so we can list and market their home, getting some measurements, getting some pictures, determining an appropriate asking price, etc. Now let's talk about specifically working with buyers. Why don't you guys please tell me in a private chat what's one of the first things that we're going to do when we start working with buyers? What's one of the early things we're going to do? I meet a buyer. They say, I want to buy a house. Can you help me? It's one of the first things we're going to do. Y'all got the abbreviation down pat and everything. Already talking like brokers. Look at you guys go. So one of the early things that we're going to do when we start working with buyers is our working with real estate agent disclosure. What if they don't hire you? They need to understand. What if they meet you at an open house? They need to understand in this transaction, you represent the seller. But what if they look at you at the open house and they say, well, this is lovely, but not quite what I'm looking for. Can you help me find something? Yeah. So now we need to have this conversation about other properties, confidentiality, having a decision about hiring me. Remember, the commission says, and this is a problem topic, but once we do the working with real estate agent disclosure, particularly with buyers, at that point, we need to decide how we're going to proceed. I need to know where to put you in my plane. Am I going to put you in first class, or am I going to put you back in coach? So even though we may start with an oral buyer agency agreement, we have to decide early on, because I need to know how to proceed. I don't owe you that confidentiality if I'm not a buyer's agent. So bottom line, once we do our disclosure, once we have this conversation, then the buyer needs to decide if they want to go through this transaction represented or unrepresented. Most buyers are going to want to be represented. Wouldn't you want to be represented? Wouldn't you want somebody on your side, especially if you've never bought a house before, or if it's been 15 years since you bought a house? But what if you were an investor and you did this 10, 12 times a year? You may not need to be represented. You may know better than I do. So the buyer has a decision to make. The buyer has to choose. Again, you guys, most want to be represented. This class kind of covers several different avenues. What if they don't want to be represented? Then they are a customer and I'm a seller sub-agent. If they don't want to be unrepresented, if you choose to be a seller sub-agent and the buyer is going to be the customer, we're going to be working as a seller sub-agent. What side of the line am I on as a seller sub-agent? Am I on the seller side or the buyer side? What side am I on? I see your mouths move. That puts us on the, that puts us on the seller side. So we have an unrepresented buyer. We're working with a buyer customer. We're going to help the buyer get through the transaction and get to closing, because isn't that what's best for my seller? Isn't that best for my seller to close and sell, convey their property? So we're still going to help them, but we need to remember what side we're on. We need to remember where in our plane we put them. If they choose not to be represented, if you're going to act as a seller sub-agent, this is a very rare time in real estate that I can actually say, we don't have a form for this. There is no form to complete because they chose not to hire me. They chose not to use the form with me, the buyer's agency agreement. We're going to document the conversation, but there's no paperwork with this. I don't get to say that often in real estate. We got a form for practically everything else. Big thing, this unrepresented buyer, it's important that they understand that I'm on the side of the seller. My fiduciary responsibilities to the seller. The seller is the one that gets old car. So that unrepresented buyer needs to understand, I don't owe you that confidentiality. Whatever you share with me, I have a duty to take back to that seller. So what if you meet this buyer and they say, no, I don't want to be represented. Just whatever. I'm fine with being a customer. All right. Try to sell yourself, sell your services. If they don't see the value in you and the services, they may not want to hire you. So sell yourself and sell your services. And if they still say no, then I proceed as a seller sub-agent. So let's say we get further into our relationship. We're out looking at properties, a couple weeks, months later, whatever. And at some point that buyer decides, maybe I do need to be represented after all. I know I said at first I didn't, but now kind of learning a little bit more, maybe it's in my best interest to be represented. We may have the ability to switch sides. We may, and I'm stressing may so much, be able to switch from a seller sub-agent to a buyer's agent. We would be upgrading the buyer and downgrading the seller. The buyer gets an upgrade from coach to first class. But before we can give that upgrade, before we can switch the buyer from a customer to a client, we first have to have a conversation with the seller and possibly the listing agent. Because if we make that switch, anything I know about the seller, I now have a duty to share with my brand new buyer client. And the seller and the listing agent have got to give us consent to do that. This is so tricky and so risky. The Real Estate Commission puts this out here as a last ditch effort. This is not how we should be conducting business. We should not just be out there trying to get buyer customers and trying to convert them later. We need to know early on how we're going to continue. And guys, honestly, I think bottom line, it comes down to us and how we are explaining these agency relationships up front. I think if we're doing a good job of explaining these agency relationships up front, the buyer's going to say, why wouldn't I hire you? Does this make sense? So if you have to, if you're in a situation where you switch, I need you to document the heck out of everything. Give everybody fully informed consent. Let the seller know you're no longer on their side. And practice your elevator speech. So the next buyer you come across, we don't have this. Somebody says, for example, you find out the seller is able to take less than asking. Later on, the buyer wants to be upgraded. Am I able to share that information? Only if I have everybody's consent. So I go to the seller and I say, I'm asking you to switch. But remember, let's remind them what they told me, right? Because you have conversations with people that you may not always remember all the time, right? So it's not just, hey, seller, I'm making this switch. It's seller, I'm making this switch. I know what you're willing to offer. If I make this switch, I now have a duty to share with my buyer. The seller may not allow it for very good reason. Can we see why this is strongly discouraged? Can we see why I want you to document? My goodness, document like you've never documented before. We may, okay, so no more of this buyer customer stuff. We have a buyer's agent, we have a buyer client. We may be able to work with the buyer client under a non-exclusive buyer agency agreement. Non-exclusive means how many firms can the buyer date? As many as they want. Who's going to get paid? The one that's the procuring cause, the one that introduced the buyer to this property that they eventually bought. Your firm may or may not allow non-exclusive buyer agency agreements. There is a form to create this relationship. And it is an agency relationship. I owe this buyer old car. They are my client, but it's not exclusive, which means I'm not binding them to work with me and only me. We do not have an exclusive relationship. Some firms don't like this. Some firms don't practice this for good reason. So a non-exclusive buyer agency agreement. We talked last week in Unit 7, another option that we have with working with a buyer at first is under an oral buyer agency agreement. This is the biggest problem topic. I owe this buyer old car. I have created agency. I just didn't use a form to do it. We have the ability to work with a buyer under an oral buyer agency agreement at first. I still have to do my disclosure, always have to do the disclosure in sales transactions. I still have to explain, I have to have a conversation about what the buyer agency means. It's an express agreement. I can't just start acting like your agent without having a conversation about what it means for me to be your agent. An express agreement means that the terms are clearly stated. Remember, we have that sample oral buyer agency agreement letter in Unit 7 and the online learning system. Just kind of give us an idea of how we can follow up that conversation with documentation. Commission rule allows us to work with a buyer under an oral buyer agency agreement at first. We must put that agency agreement in writing before I'm ready to present an offer on your behalf. I cannot present an offer on a buyer's behalf without having that written buyer agency agreement. Test questions like to trick you. We have to put it in writing before, we have to put buyer agency in writing before we write the first offer. We have to put it in writing before we show the first property. We have to put it in writing before we ask them if they want to buy the house. We don't have to put buyer agency in writing, the rule says, until we're ready to present the offer on behalf of the buyer. In other words, I can't call the listing agent or the seller and say, I am sending you my buyer's offer right now. Question comes in, what if the seller doesn't permit me to disclose material facts? The seller hides behind caveat emptor. I have to follow license law and commission rule. License law and commission rule says, I always have a duty to disclose material facts. I follow my seller's lawful instructions. If they tell me not to disclose, I cannot follow that instruction because I always have a duty to disclose material facts. We mentioned a couple caveats with oral buyer agency. We cannot demand exclusivity with buyer agency, oral buyer agency. I can't have an oral agreement and say, you're going to work with me and only me. If I start demanding exclusivity, I got to get it in writing. I got to get it in a written agency agreement. Also, under an oral agreement, we can't specify a period of time that we're going to work together. If I'm going to put a time limit on our relationship, I got to get it in a written agreement. You and I are going to work together for 2 months. That's not a handshake agreement. We've got to get that in writing. We have to reduce that. So if we're not demanding exclusivity and we're not specifying a period of time, then the latest that I have to put this oral buyer agency agreement in writing is when I'm ready to present an offer on their behalf. So that takes us up to our exclusive buyer agency agreement. When you guys see test questions, and the test questions say, this is an exclusive buyer agency agreement, you know that it is in writing. You cannot have an exclusive oral. Everybody with me? So when you see exclusive buyer agency agreement, know that it's in writing. Exclusive means the buyer's only dating one firm. When the firm connects that buyer to a seller, we've earned our fee. When it closes, we get paid. Our written buyer agency agreements usually only terminate when we close, when I've done the job I've been hired to do, or when they expire. Again, they all have to have a definite end date. Exclusive buyer agency. That's the, we got exclusive buyer agency agreement in your Unit 8 and the online learning system. We won't get there today, but that's the form we get to look at on Tuesday. If you want to look ahead, it's in the Unit 8 material for you. Focus on the highlights, same thing as the listing agreement. I got the important pieces, testable pieces highlighted for you. So look with me, if you will, in your book on page 239. And on 239, we list what are the buyer's agent's responsibilities. Congratulations, a buyer's decided to hire you. Well, what are you going to do for me? Isn't that somebody's number one question? What are you going to do for me? What's in it for me? So when a buyer hires an agent, we have certain responsibilities, and those are all spelled out for us on page 239. Obviously, we've already decided that we're going to do our working with real estate agent disclosure always early on. We're going to explain our agency duties and responsibilities. As with our listing agreement, the buyer's agency agreement is a two-way street. The firm has duties and responsibilities to the buyer has duties and responsibilities to the firm. So we need to explain my duties and responsibilities. Don't expect or don't anticipate that the buyer is going to sit down and read this agreement. The form doesn't negate us having a conversation with them. We still have a duty to explain our duties. We need to make sure that the property agency paperwork is executed, that it's completed. We're going to help our buyers qualify for a loan if need be. If it's a cash buyer, we want to verify proof of funds. They can get a letter from their bank. But most buyers will require a loan. And one of the first things I'm going to do as their buyer's agent, now that I've been hired, one of the first things I'm going to help them do is get qualification from a lender. I'm not going to show you property until I've had a lender tell me how much you can afford. I'm not going to waste my time. I'm not going to waste your time if I don't know how much home you can buy. And the way I find out how much home you can buy is because I have my buyer talk to 2 or 3 lenders. Always encourage them to shop around. More on pre-qualifications, getting your buyers pre-approved, that process. When we get to our financing units, financing is 14 and 15. So we'll talk more about that. As a buyer's agent, I'm going to get the seller disclosures in my buyer's hands. There's our RPOs again, our mauve. And the lead-based paint, if the property was built prior to 1978. I have a duty to disclose my agency status to all parties in the transaction. So if I'm communicating with a seller or a seller's agent on behalf of my buyer, I have to disclose that I'm working with a buyer. I have to disclose that I'm a buyer's agent. Remember, we said the hired buyer's agent disclosing their status to the seller or the seller's agent happens at initial contact, not for substantial contact, but initial. So if I'm communicating to anybody else on behalf of my buyer, I say, hi, this is Julie Campbell, and I'm working with a buyer that's interested in your listing. We have to disclose our agency status. There's those dang material facts again. As a buyer's agent, I have a duty not only to disclose material facts, but help my buyer discover them. Help them look for red flags. Guys, when I show property, when we walk in the front door, when we pull in the driveway, the buyers and I are generally looking at 2 different things. The buyer's pulling in wondering how that home fits their family dynamics. Do you see yourself having Sunday brunch here? Do you see yourself doing Friday night family game night here, right? That's what the buyers are looking for. I need to be looking up at the ceilings for cracks and walls and down at the floor. I'm helping them look at the home. They're going in with rose-colored glasses. I'm going in looking for red flags. I'm not the one buying this home. So I'm not going in there going, gosh, I can see my family hanging out here on a Sunday afternoon. Everybody with me? We need to look at 2 different things to help them see everything. And when you see something, say something, because they're not going to see that the first time they're in. They want to know if Fido has enough somewhere to hang out in the sun during the afternoon, right? I mean, they're looking at how their family's going to work under this roof. We're helping them discover and disclose material facts. I just looked at my time. All right, so I hate to end smack dab in the middle of something, but you know, it is what it is. So when we come back together on Tuesday, this is what Tuesday is going to look like. We're going to finish this discussion of our buyer's agent's responsibilities. So we're going to talk about those last three things. We're going to finish the rest of the material of Unit 8, and then we're going to pick up the calculator. So if math isn't your thing, I do recommend that you guys look at the math concepts starting on page 242. Start exposing yourself to that so you can be ready for us to do your commission math on Tuesday. We'll also look at the buyer agency agreement briefly. Next week, once we get done with Unit 8, we move on to Unit 9. We'll get through that pretty quickly, and then we're going to start on Unit 10. Once again, I encourage you to go back and review Unit 7 and 8, review what we've covered, let those little light bulbs click, and then look ahead at where we're going so you can be prepared for next week. It is 1 o'clock on the dot. Y'all have a great weekend. Please never hesitate to reach out to me if I can help you. I'm not a mind reader. Let me help you. I wish I were. Maybe. No, never mind. Okay. Y'all have a great weekend. We'll see everybody on Tuesday.